Today, I am summarizing the Stormlight Archive Book 3, Oathbringer by Brandon Sanderson. This is going to be an in-depth summary. I'm going chapter by chapter. I spent the entire month working on this video. I really hope you guys enjoy it. I do have summaries up for The Way of Kings and Words of Radiance as well, so make sure to check those out if you haven't. Now, this isn't going to have any spoilers for Book 4 and 5 of the Stormlight Archive. If this is your first time reading Oathbringer, then you're free to watch this. However, I do mention some COSMERE connections and Easter eggs from other COSMERE books as they appear in Oathbringer. But if you prefer to skip the Easter eggs, I do mention ahead of time before they appear so that you can skip past them. Now, like I said, I have been working on this video the entire month, and I've also been turning down sponsors so that I can get this video to you guys completely sponsor free. However, that being said, this took a massive amount of work. So if you do want to support the channel further, if you enjoy these videos and you like this project that I'm doing, which by the way, eventually I plan on summarizing every book in the COSMERE. If you want an extra way to support this project, the best way to do that is to send some support over on Ko-Fi. 100% of the donations on Ko-Fi go to the creator. Or if you prefer to have some extra perks, you can join my Patreon. Over on there, I'm uploading the audio file for this summary so that you can listen to it ad-free as sort of a podcast. And we got other perks on there as well. Soon I'm releasing a long reading music video for the Stormlight Archive with a bunch of Stormlight art, so you can listen to that while you read through Wind and Truth. But really, even just commenting and sharing the video, that helps out so much, and I appreciate all the support, guys, for these videos. It means a lot to me. Now, without further ado, let's dive in to Oathbringer. Starting off with the prologue, To Weep. Like all the other prologues, this one takes place 6 years ago, but this time from Eshonai's perspective. Eshonai arrives at the signing of the peace treaty between the humans and the listeners, and she's saddened by the rhythmless ones, the enslaved parshmen who can only obey, unable to even perceive the invitation to join the city celebration. She wanders the castle and catches sight of King Gavinor and Amaram, who informs her that the king would like to speak with her. Now, Gavinor shows her a fabrial, explaining how it functions by trapping spren within gem hearts, a method that mimics the Parshendi's own ability to take on new forms. Now, Eshonai is both impressed and unsettled by the humans' innovations, realizing they have discovered how to harness the powers once thought exclusive to her people. Gavinor believes the world is stagnant and in need of major cataclysm in order to unite and progress, and Eshonai becomes increasingly alarmed when Gavinor expresses his intent to bring back the old gods, the very entities that her people had long abandoned. To emphasize his message, Gavinor presents Eshonai with a dark sphere that emanates a strange, malevolent light, and he claims that the sphere contains a god and instructs her to deliver a message to the Council of Five, urging them to remember their heritage and wake up. Horrified, Eshonai flees from the meeting, grasping the implications of Gavinor's words and his apparent lack of understanding of the danger he wishes to unleash. Later on, after informing the Council of Five about Gavinor's plan to reawaken their gods, Clade mentions hearing a voice that guided him to an assassin, and the Five agree to have the king assassinated. As Eshonai leaves, she weeps, realizing the irreversible path they've chosen in the face of the king's terrifying ambitions. We then begin Part 1, United, which covers chapters 1 to 32 and interludes 1 to 3. 6 days after arriving in Urithiru, Dalinar Kholin, now a Knight Radiant bonded to the Stormfather, has control over all of his visions and is revisiting the very first vision he experienced. He stands on a cliff with the Almighty, overlooking the ruins of Kholinar, and as he explores the rubble, he finds claw-like bleak gouges scarring the stones, and he realizes that Kholinar won't fall from the Everstorm alone, but from something even greater. He's frustrated that the world's monarchs refuse to unite with him, and apparently there's riots in Kholinar, and the queen has gone silent. Now Dalinar stays in this vision as long as he can, and he catches a glimpse of a mysterious figure in black shard plate, bathed in a golden light and casting 9 shadows. Shadows that the Stormfather identifies as the Unmade, Spren of Odium. And this figure is Odium's champion. Now, the vision ends and Navani pledges to help him unite the world as Dalinar realizes he needs to find more radiance. A messenger arrives announcing that Sadeas has been murdered. We then briefly switch over to Adolin, who's busy overseeing the influx of people and supplies into Urithiru when he also hears the news that something has been discovered on the 3rd floor, and the weight of having killed Sadeas haunts him. Dalinar arrives to find Bridge 4 and Sadeas' men about to throw fists, as Bridge 4 is falsely accused of killing Sadeas, but Dalinar calms the situation. He appoints the high princes that follow him to various positions in the kingdom and orders Shallan and Renarin to practice their powers so they can lead the other knights that will eventually come to them. We then get a flashback 34 years ago. Dalinar charges through a battlefield with his elite guard, causing some of his enemies to flee in terror. He laughs as he kills, but doesn't yet feel the thrill, so he seeks a greater challenge. He spots an enemy Bright Lord on horseback surrounded by an honor guard and orders Janin to shoot the horse. He then fights a bloody battle, suffering both a broken nose and a broken shield, and right before the Bright Lord strikes him down, the thrill comes and Dalinar stabs the crown prince. As he orders his men to take hostages in the village, an arrow slams into his shoulder and they capture the assassin. The captain of Dalinar's elites, Thaka, says the shot was fired from almost 400 yards. Now Dalinar is amazed at this accuracy, and he recruits the assassin named Taleb into his own army by promising not to pillage the town. Now, an interesting detail, Taleb has a blue tattoo on his cheek, and this signifies he's one of the old blood, descendant of a dynasty that ruled Elithkar before the Light Eyes. Back in the town, Sadeas in golden yellow shardplate has already executed the local high princes and officers and displayed their heads on spikes. He's disappointed to hear that he can't loot the town. Now back to the present, Dalinar and Navani watch the Everstorm sweep by below, and he gazes into the storm and sees a vision of destruction. The Stormfather warns him that their enemy rides with the storm and is watching. After, he insists to Navani that they should have a formal wedding. However, Navani is concerned that Dalinar's hesitation might mean he's still tied to his late wife's memory. But Dalinar then opens up and shares to her that he doesn't even remember his wife due to the old magic. He sees her as a blur and her name inaudible, and he can't even remember if he loved her, but he assumes he must have if the pain of losing her drove him to speak with the Nightwatcher. He does, however, recall feeling hatred and the thrill on the day that she died, a memory that still haunts him. Now, all the Ardents refuse to officiate their wedding due to the taboo against their marriage, so Dalinar proposes the Stormfather himself marry them. And then the family all gathers together on the tower roof to watch the wedding, and the Stormfather has Dalinar and Navani swear oaths of loyalty to each other, before abruptly leaving once they do. Now, Kadash, one of Dalinar's soldiers turned Ardents, remains behind, and is disturbed by Dalinar's claim that the Almighty is dead, and that only a Spren fragment remains. Now, Dalinar mentions having felt something else, a warmth and a light, and he believes that it's not that God has died, it's that the Almighty was never God. Now, I'm not sure, but maybe this warmth and light is a glimpse of the true God residing over the entirety of the COSMERE, something greater than even Adonalsium, the God beyond. We then switch over to Kaladin, who's approaching Hearthstone. He's exhausted and devoid of Stormlight, which he ran out of 3 days prior. He wasn't able to make it in time. The Everstorm already passed through the area earlier that day, and as he walks, he feels dread at what he might find. Now, it's worth noting that we also get this map of Elithkar, which says annotated for your convenience, and it's safe to assume that, like many of the other notes, this is Naz's writing, likely being documented for Chris. I just wonder though, why are World Hoppers interested in where Kaladin grew up? Maybe he's writing a novel about the most depressed man in the whole Cosmere? Who knows? The town is eerily silent, and anxious, Kaladin heads for Roshone's manor and sees a faint light inside. A guard at the door spots him and commands him to enter, and inside he recognizes people from the town, but they don't recognize him due to his ragged appearance. He shoves a guard aside, determined to find his parents, and he eventually finds his father, Lirin, who takes a moment to recognize Kaladin as his son. Kaladin's mother, Hesina, is called in, and they share a tearful and emotional reunion. His parents overjoyed to see him alive, while Kaladin still carries the weight of his grief over Tien's death. His failure pressed down on him with an almost physical sensation, like the weight of a bridge he was forced to carry all on his own. However, they're interrupted when the guard insist on taking Kaladin into custody as a branded deserter. Lirin stands up for his son, threatening to quit as the town's surgeon if they arrest him. Now, oddly, Syl seems to recognize Hesina, and she claims that she's known Kaladin's family long before even meeting him, saying that everyone is somehow connected. Now, Roshone appears and tries to provoke Kaladin, who responds by punching him in the face, saying, "That was for my friend Moash." Roshone then orders his guards to attack. However, intimidated, they hesitate, and regretting his impulsive act, Kaladin apologizes and tells the guards to stand down, then orders them to gather in the library for a meeting. And when Roshone challenges his authority, Kaladin summons his shard blade, turning his eyes bright blue and signaling his rank. In the library, Cal learns that the Parshmen in Hearthstone underwent a transformation and left town without attacking. Roshone's wife, Laeral, gives Cal some supplies that he asked for, including a span reed so he can report to Dalinar. He then summons his Silblade again for Roshone to emphasize that he's in charge, and he tells Roshone that he needs to step up and help his people of Hearthstone. However, the Bright Lord just slumps in his chair, but his wife steps up and pledges to lead the people. Cal then returns to his parents and helps his father tend to the wounded, and Lirin expresses disappointment. Although he acknowledges the need to fight the Voidbringers, Lirin had wanted his son to heal rather than kill. "You're a surgeon, father, but I'm something else, a watcher at the rim." Words spoken to Dalinar Kholin in a vision. Kaladin stood up. "I will protect those who need it. Today, that means hunting down some Voidbringers." Navani begins communicating on the span reed, and Kaladin reports on the Parshmen's strange departure and proposes to track them down. Dalinar agrees and instructs Kaladin to keep him updated. Now Cal then goes to his mother, who's holding his new baby brother, Orodin, whose name means Child of Peace. Kaladin reached out. His mother let him take the little boy, hold him in hands which seemed too rough to be touching such soft skin. Kaladin trembled, then pulled the child tight against him. Memories of this place had not broken him, and seeing his parents had not overwhelmed him. But this, he could not stop the tears. Before leaving, he trades his parents for infused spheres, offering them 2 for 1. And then, seeing the fear of the people around him, he bursts into Stormlight, reassuring them that the Knights Radiant have returned and will protect them. He then flies off toward a nearby town, aiming to gather more infused spheres for his journey. Switching over to Shallan, who attempts to sketch the vast towers of Urithiru, but struggles, her drawings appearing more and more surreal, and she's also actively trying not to think about the revelation of the truth that she spoke in the last book regarding her parents' death. Now, a scout, Lyn, arrives and escorts Shallan to a meeting, and Shallan doesn't like all the new attention she draws as a Radiant, and so she pretends to be an Elsecaller to conceal her abilities of creating illusions. Upon reaching the meeting, she finds Navani, Dalinar, and his sons discussing the daunting task of uniting the continent's rulers. She feels drawn to the map on the wall and pulls in her Stormlight, creating a three-dimensional projection of the entire continent. Dalinar marvels at this, suspecting that the Stormfather's power might have merged with theirs to allow this ability. And using the projection, they focus their strategy on securing the Oathgates in Azure, Yakaved, and Thaylen. Dalinar mentions that he's seen the enemy's champion with 9 shadows and red eyes, perhaps a Parshman. And when he says this, Renarin's eyes go wide and his jaw drops. Has Renarin also been seeing visions of this champion? Now at that moment, Lyn interrupts and reports another murder in the tower. They rush to the crime scene and they find the body of Vedekar Perel, a soldier from Sabarial's army. The murder appears disturbingly similar to Sadeas's death, with identical wounds and positioning of the corpse. Adolin is visibly shaken, unable to hide his shock, and Dalinar assigns him to lead the investigation, which catches him completely off guard. Nearby, Renarin watches Adolin closely while Pattern hums thoughtfully. Back to Kaladin, who spent the last 2 days searching for signs of Voidbringers and warning anyone he finds that the Everstorm is going to return. And as he approaches a small village of Horn Hollow, he's surprised to find that word of his arrival has already spread, and the townspeople, looking with admiration, are eager to trade him infused spears. They explain to him how Parshmen raided their grain storage, then headed towards Kholinar. Now Syl observes the awkwardness of the female Ardent and teases Kaladin that the girl is infatuated with him, and then Syl playfully offers to teach him about relationships, even suggesting Shallan as a match. Now Kaladin is intrigued by Shallan, but dismisses the idea since she's already engaged to Adolin. He suddenly realizes that Syl, as his spren, is going to be around whenever he's intimate, and the thought unsettles him. He then heads off in the direction of Kholinar, encouraged by the cheers of the villagers. Meanwhile, Adolin visits Gallant to mourn the loss of his horse, Surblood. Now Renarin arrives and mentions he can no longer bear to use his shard blade, revealing that he's created his own blade. You mink, you've managed to create a radiant blade. Why didn't you tell us? It just happened. Gliss wasn't certain he could do it, but we need more people to work the Oathgate, so... He took a deep breath, then stretched his hand to the side and summoned a long glowing shard blade. Thin, with almost no crossguard, it had waving folds to the metal, like it had been forged. However, Renarin feels like he doesn't fit in. He was starting to fit in with Bridge 4, but now his role as a Radiant means he must embrace a new path. He fears making mistakes with his power, and he's uncertain about his place. Then sensing his brother's doubt, Adolin clasps his hand to offer support, and feels a surge of stormlight flow through him. Renarin looked to him, then smiled. A pulse of radiance washed through Adolin, and for an instant, he saw himself perfected, a version of himself that was somehow complete and whole, the man he could be. Stunned, he realizes that his injured wrist is now healed, and Renarin, embarrassed, leaves quickly, leaving Adolin surprised at his brother's new abilities. 33 years ago, Dalinar, wearing his new shard plate, awaits the start of a battle alongside Gavilar and Sadeas. They discuss their campaign to unite the princedoms under Gavilar's rule. Now, their efforts, however, have only pushed most of the other princedoms to unite against them. They set their sights on Lord Tanalan, who holds a shard blade but no plate. Gavilar leads the charge, and eventually they break through the city's defenses, wreaking havoc on Tanalan's soldiers. Dalinar, exhilarated by the intoxicating influence of the thrill, looks over the city and senses something off right before the ground beneath him collapses, sending him and all the soldiers crashing down through layers of buildings into the rift below. Though his shard plate is damaged, Dalinar survives the fall, unlike many of the elite troops. A rain of arrows follows, and he dashes across a bridge, narrowly escaping a second fall. He then confronts Lord Tannalan, who bears the shard blade Oathbringer. Dalinar defeats him by throwing them both down the rift again, and numb yet fueled from the thrill, he follows the soldiers who retrieve their dying lord into a hiding place, and there he finds Tannalan's weeping wife and their 6-year-old son, who struggles to lift Oathbringer to defend himself and his mother. Later, Dalinar sits with his new shard blade, Oathbringer, numbing his shame and pain with wine. Gavilar joins him, talking about their conquest, and he points out that the people of the Rift are likely to rebel, enraged by the death of their lord and his heir. As Dalinar leans back to rest, he's haunted by the young boy's cries. Back to the present, Dalinar tries asking the Stormfather about the ancient betrayal of the Knights Radiant, but the Stormfather says that some things are best left forgotten. He then speaks with the Prime of Azure over Spanreed, learning that the Azish have opened negotiations with the Parshmen. He offers his aid and encourages the Prime to come and visit Urithiru, and when that fails, he offers to come visit himself through the Oathgate, but they claim their Oathgate is no longer functional. Navani and Tashav suspect they're lying. And then he's contacted by Queen Fen of Thaylena, and she describes the devastation the Everstorm left in its wake, with the Voidbringers stealing most of their ships and the city itself heavily damaged. Now Dalinar proposes an international council of monarchs to unite against the enemy, but she dismisses this idea, doubting his intentions. He then offers his troops to help rebuild the city, and as a final appeal, he suggests ways for her to identify Radiance among her people, offering training for any that she finds. He makes very little progress with all the other rulers, and Elhokar believes they might fear Dalinar's influence. Elhokar then reveals his own insecurities, admitting he struggles as king and is prepared to abdicate in Dalinar's favor. But Dalinar proposes a compromise. He will assume the title of King of Urithiru and the Shattered Plains, leaving Elhokar under Elhokar's rule. Elhokar then agrees to go to the city with Kaladin to activate its Oathgate and secure a passage to Urithiru. Just then, a message arrives from Taravangian, the king of Yakaved and Kharbranth. Taravangian fully supports Dalinar's plan and even offers a radiant of his own to attempt their own Oathgate, making a small victory for Dalinar in his pursuit for unity. Shallan is interrupted from her light weaving by Adolin knocking on the door. She's caught off guard in only her nightgown with her safe hand exposed, so she quickly dresses while they exchange playful banter through the door. She then invites him in, and Adolin wonders aloud if it's appropriate for him to be alone in her bedroom. And to ease his concerns, Shallan enlists Pattern as their chaperone, explaining that his job is to ensure nothing inappropriate happens.
Inappropriate? Such as dividing by 0?
And when Pattern finally understands, to the embarrassment of Shallan, he takes his duty to prevent mating very seriously.
Very well, you two. Now mating.
Now Adolin ends up opening up about his insecurities regarding their betrothal and how he doesn't want to make the same mistakes of past relationships. And they start to kiss until Pattern starts yelling at them or buzzing at them to stop.
No mating!
We then briefly switch to Kaladin, who's spying on a group of Parshmen expecting to find fierce Voidbringers, but instead of monsters, he sees a ragged group trying to play cards and barely surviving. They have minimal carapace armor and no red eyes. Some attempt to light a fire under a tarp, while others chew on soggy, raw grain from stolen sacks. Suddenly, a yellow ribbon of light streaks past, and one of the Parshmen raises alarm. The group scrambles for makeshift weapons, and realizing they pose no real threat, Kaladin makes the decision to surrender himself. Now back to Shallan and Adolin, they're discussing the strange copycat murder, and Adolin insists there must be 2 killers. But Shallan gets kind of annoyed as there's no evidence to prove this. Adolin then shifts the conversation to Shallan's Shardblade. He argues that despite being a woman, she should learn to wield it for her own safety, and he offers to teach her. As he heads off to get blade guards for practice, Shallan is overcome with dread, haunted by memories of killing her mother with her blade. And to push through her fear, Shallan adopts a new persona, channeling someone poised and confident, much like Yasna. She names this alter ego that can face the blade without fear, Brightness Radiant. When Adolin returns, he guides her through some of the stances, and as they practice simple strikes together, she notices Adolin's deep passion for swordsmanship, and realizing it parallels her own love for art. She feels a growing bond with him, allowing herself to switch back to her true self as they practice. Now in this chapter, we get another very odd art piece, and you can see how Shallan drew the strata, the air ducts, and the passageways of Urithiru, but it's all very surreal and creepy and almost Junji Ito-esque in style. Huge shout out to Ben McSweeney for really capturing that twistedness that Shallan feels when drawing Urithiru. Dalinar examines the Honor Blade that Kaladin took from Szeth. Unlike a regular Shard Blade, the Honor Blade feels warm to the touch, and it doesn't scream when he holds it. Now, talking to the Stormfather, Dalinar learns more about honor and Odium, discovering that Odium, as a primal force, must follow certain rules. Dalinar asks if Honor's suggestion to challenge Odium to a duel through a champion might succeed, and the Stormfather agrees it could work, and if successful, it might buy humanity precious time. Now Navani informs him that the Iriali Queen is ready to speak with him. He insists on holding the conversation while sparring, and he tosses a sword to Kadash and begins a duel as he dictates. Now the Queen reveals her people's growing inclination to ally with the Voidbringers, and she expresses resentment over the shard plate that Dalinar took, a slight dating back to his conquest days. She demands her shard plate back, but her claim is tenuous due to her lack of direct connection to Evie. Now the conversation ends and Dalinar suddenly realizes that he can now remember his late wife's name, Evie. A flood of long repressed memories overtakes him and he collapses from the emotional impact. Back to Kaladin, who's now a prisoner of the freed Parshmen. One of them wants to kill him, but the others persuade her otherwise. And as night falls, Kaladin is untied by the Parshmen who had been playing cards, and they both escape and begin their journey together. Kaladin strikes up conversation with the Parshmen that's accompanied by his young daughter, and he realizes that these Parshmen are essentially runaway slaves seeking freedom, and he feels like he can relate to them, and he tells them that he was once a slave too, but they insist that their situations are different. Parshmen were robbed of their minds, not just their freedom. Now Cal notices Syl behaving oddly, and he learns that she's pretending to be a Windspren, fearing that the Voidspren might notice her. She also tells him that the Everstorm was what restored the Parshmen's identities. Now the one Parshman named Sa is frustrated with having to relearn skills that he should already know, and he's frustrated about the Yellow Spren who apparently are constantly ordering them around. Cal then begins teaching them basic survival skills, such as preserving food, and he builds a fire to keep them warm as he tends to their wounds, and teaches them how to bandage their injuries. Meanwhile, Shallan adopts her Veil persona and sneaks out to the market to gather information. As they walk, Pattern confides that he likes Adolin, rationalizing that wielding a corpse like a shard blade is simply a necessity of the physical realm, where destruction is part of survival. arrival. Now, she finds herself at a local bar and trying to blend in, she orders a drink and unintentionally chooses an extremely potent wine that almost makes her vomit. She continues drinking and soon becomes very, very drunk. She gets some info about a recent stabbing from the bouncer, and as she staggers out, she recovers quickly by using stormlight to alleviate her drunkenness. Now, she heads to another shady tavern, and here she orders the strongest drink, a Horn Eater White. And this time she heals herself as she drinks. Now Vale sits down with a group of thugs in the corner and starts questioning a woman named Betha. When a large horn-eater named returns from the restroom and tries to reclaim his seat, Vale stabs her own safe hand along with to assert dominance, and threatens to do worse unless she gets answers. She then idly scrapes the symbol of the Ghost Bloods into the table, and finally Betha is scared and gives the information that a man strangled his wife the other night, but bizarrely he claims he had no memory of committing an identical murder the following night when a barmaid was found strangled the exact same way. Something very odd is going on. Now we then get a flashback 31 years ago. Dalinar attends a feast with his brother and Sadeas, and he realizes that he's forgotten his favorite knife. He heads out into the high storm to look for it, and he glimpses a strange, monstrous figure with glowing legs in the storm. When he returns, everyone is horrified that he just went out for a casual stroll in the midst of such carnage. We learn that Evie's brother, Toe, is trying to secure an alliance by bargaining with a set of shardplate that he brought from Rhaenyra. Gavilar suggests that Dalinar marry Evie to cement the alliance and acquire the shardplate. And then Dalinar's attention lands on an assassin disguised as a servant. He quickly kills the assassin, stabbing him repeatedly with his own knife. Calmly, he washes the blood off in his wine goblet and resumes his meal. With this demonstration of deadly skill fresh in everyone's mind, he agrees to marry Evie, certain that his action will help secure the alliance. In chapter 21, Shallan, hungover and exhausted, wakes to Adolin's knocking. She agrees to accompany him to a meeting with Sadeas' widow, Ialai. Arriving at Sadeas' camp, they're escorted inside and they find Mraize standing beside Ialai, disguised as a common soldier with an odd-looking chicken perched on his shoulder. Ialai subtly accuses Dalinar of killing Sadeas, but Adolin firmly denies the accusation. Shallan gets the opportunity to speak with Mraize in private, and here he makes her aware that he knows of her use of the Ghostblood symbol the previous night. Now he assigns her a new task: secure Urithiru by eliminating the darkness within, and in return, he'll let her know what happened to her brother Helleran. She returns to the meeting and Ialai says Adolin should investigate his own people for Sadeas' murderer, hinting that someone might have acted on Dalinar's behalf without a direct order. She then shocks them both by instructing them to report their findings to the man leading her own investigation, Meridas Amaram. Now there is a minor COSMERE Easter egg that I want to mention here that's related to a short story called Sixth of the Dusk. Again, it's very minor. Now, Sanderson has confirmed that Mraize's chicken is actually an Aviar from First of the Sun, the planet from Sixth of the Dusk. And if you don't know, these Aviar have different telepathic abilities. Some can shield your thoughts, and others can show you places that you might die. And it is hinted there could be more abilities as well, we just don't really know too much about Aviar. But as of yet, it's pretty hard to guess what ability Mraize's chicken has. And yes, it's not actually a chicken, but we're gonna keep calling it a chicken. Moving back to Kaladin, who shelters in a bunker with the Parshmen during a high storm. He notices that Syl is hiding, meaning that a Voidspren is watching him. New Parshmen join, and Ken promises to speak on Kaladin's behalf to the group. And suddenly the Voidspren, appearing as a yellow glowing woman, approaches him. She asks if he would consider fighting for the Parshmen and offers to speak for him as well. She then asks him how he knew a high storm was approaching, and Kaladin plays it off, claiming that he simply could feel it, and then she leaves with a knowing smile. Meanwhile, Dalinar waits at an Oathgate. Lost in thoughts of his late wife, he can now recall what she looked like and some memories of their betrothal, but not the details of her death. He remembers that her passing led him down a path of drinking and eventually led him to the Nightwatcher, though he still can't recall what he asked for. The Oathgate activates and Taravangian arrives with his head scribe, Adrotagia, and he introduces Malata, a Dustbringer. Now Taravangian seems kind of childlike. He's acting dense and relying on his scribe to speak on his behalf. As they ride the elevator to the top of Urithiru, Dalinar and Navani observe Taravangian's strange behavior and question if he'll be of any help in this condition. They then discuss the Nightwatcher's deals and how the deals always last until death, so it's really odd that Dalinar's seems to be wearing off. Once they arrive, Taravangian learns that he's the only other monarch that's arrived so far. They receive a note from the God King of Tukar, who refuses Dalinar's alliance. And then Taravangian believes that Dalinar should just start attacking and begin conquering the world, but Dalinar refuses. Switching to Shallan, while exploring Urithiru, she finds an abandoned amphitheater, and using her light-weaving abilities, she conjures a play for pattern, telling the story of a curious girl who lives in a walled village, built to protect her people from a great evil. Driven by curiosity, the girl climbs over the wall, finding stairs leading to another village illuminated by stormlight. She brings this stormlight back to her village, and she discovers that her people were the evil monsters all along. They were being separated from the peaceful society on the other side. Now, she ends up running out of stormlight before she can finish the story, and she realizes that she unconsciously created a vague audience for the play. When the stormlight runs out, she notices one shadowy figure that wasn't part of her illusion. Intrigued and alarmed, she chases after the mysterious figure. Entering another room, she encounters visions of her various personas, childhood versions of herself, Veil, and others, which quickly fade, leaving her alone. And she catches a glimpse of the shadow figure climbing through a shaft leading to the market. A dark mass wriggled deep inside, squeezing between walls. Like goo, but with bits jutting out. Those were elbows, ribs, fingers splayed along one wall, each knuckle bending backward. The thing twisted, head deforming in the tiny confines, and looked toward her. She saw eyes reflecting her light, twin spheres set in a mashed head, a distorted human visage. Rushing to the market, she arrives too late, discovering that Rock was stabbed in the hand by what she suspects is the same figure who mimicked her actions at the tavern earlier. She's approached by Ishna, a woman from the bar who wants to join the Ghostbloods, but Shallan turns her away. Now in this chapter, we get another very creepy image by Ben McSweeney, and this time, Shallan appears to have drawn some undead horse swirling into darkness. It kind of looks like pattern in the middle, to be honest. Clearly, there is something very wrong going on, and we should be worried. We then flash back 29 years ago. Evie is burning a prayer for her fiancé before he heads to battle. She urges him not to kill out of anger, encouraging him to act as a man rather than a beast. Gavilar instructs Dalinar to kill Kholinar, the Shardbearer's High Prince, as a final step toward uniting the kingdom. And during the fight, Dalinar, lost in the thrill, kills indiscriminately, unaware he's even slain some of his own men, until Kadash snaps him out of his frenzy. Dalinar's bloodlust draws out Kholinar, whom he confronts on a Rishadium. They engage in a brutal duel, ending up on a high ledge where Kholinar loses his shardblade and clings to the edge, pleading for mercy. Dalinar runs him through, feeling an odd emptiness despite the victory. Filled with strength and arrogance from the thrill, Dalinar's overcome with the sense that he alone deserves power. He charges toward Gavilar with an impulse to kill him, but stops just in time, horrified by his own thoughts. In a symbolic gesture, Dalinar gives Gavilar the shard plate and blade that he won, declaring that he will never be king. Now back to Shallan. She's attending a meeting, but she's lost in her own sketching and barely paying attention. She shows Pattern a drawing of the creature that she chased previously, and Pattern doesn't recognize it precisely, but he confirms that it's of Odium. And we actually get to see Shallan's sketch in this chapter, and it's very much an eldritch or Lovecraftian monster. Now Malata, the Dustbringer, approaches Shallan and strikes up a conversation, mentioning that she doesn't answer to Taravangian and that her spren, Spark, was the one interested in Urithiru. She believes this desolation is an exaggeration and it's unnecessary to gather more radiance. Before Shallan can respond, Ialai enters to announce that Amaram has assumed leadership of the Sadeas princedom. Adolin openly insults Amaram, leading Dalinar to dismiss his son from the room. Now Shallan follows, and she confides in Adolin that she believes Amaram killed her brother, Helleran. She's completely stunned when Adolin reveals that Kaladin was the one who killed the Shardbearer on that day in order to save Amaram, and she shuts this information away, not wanting to think about it. Looking through her sketchbook, she finds disturbing, violent drawings, and she has no memory of even creating these. Shaken, she decides to assign her soldiers, or squires, a dangerous task. Now back to Dalinar, he's frustrated that the Azish want to destroy their Oathgate, and Queen Fen has declined the treaty because she doesn't want the Blackthorn marching his army through their Oathgate. He's then summoned to see Bridge 4, who presents him with Oathbringer, Sadeas' shard blade. Dalinar picks it up and hears the scream of the dead spren within, and he asks the Stormfather if it can be healed. The Stormfather replies that he knows of no way to restore it. Now Dalinar then takes the blade to Ialai and respectfully lays it on the floor. Spotting Amaram nearby, he reminds him that he will face judgment for killing defenseless men. Amaram retorts that Dalinar is a hypocrite, as he too has slain thousands with a shard blade. Later, the Stormfather tries to assure Dalinar that he's not a hypocrite, but Dalinar remains unconvinced. He wants to learn more about Noadon, and he wants to explore one of the visions again. And this sparks an idea to Dalinar. He could invite Queen Fen into a shared vision to let her witness his sincerity. Now back to Shallan. In her Veil persona, she meets her squires at a tavern to gather updates on recent violent incidents, and they report that the only recent death was a man hanged after a bar fight. Soon after, she hears screams and rushes toward them to find that someone has been hanged. Using Stormlight to boost her speed, Shallan races after the killer with Pattern's guidance, and she follows them to a hidden room with a deep pit, and she sends Pattern to fetch Adolin for backup. She lightweaves back into Shallan, and Adolin arrives with his shard plate and the full force of Bridge 4. Together, they descend into the pit, entering a room covered in mysterious murals. The ceiling depicts the 10 heralds, and the walls show 3 figures, including one representing the Almighty. Adolin uses his shard blade to open 2 locked doors, revealing a decaying library. And down a 3rd tunnel, Renarin spots a large black mass resembling glistening tar. He identifies it as Re-Shephir, the Midnight Mother, one of the Unmade. The creature attacks by creating copies of people out of black goo, forcing Adolin and Bridge 4 to retreat. Shallan uses her light weaving to create illusions of fighters, causing the Unmade to shrink back. The group launches another assault, and Shallan uses her illusions to aid them, but they're again forced to fall back. And in a desperate move, Shallan reaches out and touches the black mass with her bare safe hand. And this creates a sort of telepathic bond with the Unmade. Re-Shephir is both fascinated and repelled by humanity, drawn to violence, but fearful of being controlled. Sensing Shallan's power, Re-Shephir tries to bond with her, hoping to replace Pattern. Shallan clings to Pattern, refusing to break their bond, and realizing that the Unmade fears being trapped again by a Lightweaver, Shallan uses this and pretends that she's fully committed to capturing Re-Shephir. Terrified, the Unmade flees. When it leaves, Teft notices that the pillar that the Midnight Mother was surrounding is covered with large cut gemstones, a treasure worth more than most kingdoms, and a potential source of significant power. Kaladin arrives at the city of Revel with his group of Parshmen only to find that it's already been conquered and the humans have been put in open pens. A fused approaches and realizing he needs to leave, Kaladin grabs a bag of spheres and flies off. He spots some humans below in open pens and urges them to find shelter. And just then, two flying fused attack, but he's able to lose them in the high storm. He then somehow uses his stormlight to create a windbreak with the help of Windspren, allowing some of the humans to get back to safety. And when one of the fused returns to pursue him, Kaladin lets the storm sweep him up, lashing himself upward to escape. He loses the fused and Syl helps guide him toward Urithiru. Following her confrontation with the Midnight Mother, Shallan is speaking with Pelona and describing Re-Shephir as almost human, explaining that the Unmade seem driven by a desire to understand humanity. She mimics human behavior by killing, trying to comprehend their emotions and experiences. And Re-Shephir had been waiting in Urithiru since her last escape centuries ago. And Shallan realizes that the other Unmade are still out there, posing similar threats. Adolin suddenly bursts into the room announcing that Jasnah Kholin has returned. And with that big reveal, we then move on to Interlude 1. The day after the very first ever storm, a blue-skinned Natin man named Puli, who is a lighthouse keeper, is helping his community clean up and recover from the devastation. However, secretly, he's happy about the arrival of this new storm blowing in the wrong direction. Although it's scattered wood all across the shore, he sees it as an easy way to collect material, but more importantly, he views the storm as a long-awaited sign that his grandfather's stories are coming true. His grandfather had told him legends of lost sailors who lived on a hidden island near the Origin, and these sailors were foretold to return to the Rosharan continent when the night was darkest in order to reclaim the ancient lands of Natanatan. Puli believes that this Everstorm must signal a coming time of changes. Interlude 2. Alista, an Ardent, is struggling to find a quiet spot in her monastery. Discussions about the Everstorm fill every corner, and frustrated, she heads outside to escape the constant arguments and begins reading a romance novel. Now, she doesn't notice Irv, another Ardent, approach until it's too late to hide her book. And Irv, curious, inquires about her progress on translating the Dawn Chant, noting her unmatched skill in translation and analysis. Alista attributes her success to being less distracted by the Everstorm than all the others. Spotting her novel, he offers her the sequel in exchange for help with a challenging Dawn Chant passage. Interlude 3. Within the chasms of the Shattered Plains, Venli, accompanied by other Parshendi in storm form, follow a Voidspren named Ulim in search of her sister, Eshonai. She eventually stumbles upon Eshonai's Shardblade and soon realizes that Eshonai is dead. Overcome with sorrow, Venli attunes to the rhythm of the lost, an older, less powerful rhythm, and grieves for her sister. But Ulim interrupts her grief, commanding her to remove the Shardplate from Eshonai's body. Venli resents taking orders from a Spren, but reluctantly complies. Ulim justifies Eshonai's death, arguing that they would have lost control of her eventually, and that her death is ultimately for the best. As Venli leaves, she catches sight of a small Spren resembling a ball of light, and dismissively shoos it away. Now, I do want to mention the epigraphs in part 1 of Oathbringer. The epigraphs at the beginning of each chapter are a preface of the in-universe book of the same name. I won't be going over every epigraph here, but there's a lot to unpack, so feel free to pause if you want to read it fully. Now, we eventually learn that Oathbringer, My Glory and My Shame, is a book written by Dalinar Kholin in the year 1174 during the True Desolation. And it's basically a record of Dalinar's life and journey written by his own hand in the Vorin women's script. And now we move on to part 2, New Beginnings Sing. This covers chapters 33 to 57 and interludes 4 to 6. Shallan finds Jasnah near the jewel-encrusted pillar, and Jasnah, examining the pillar, notices that it's not one single gemstone, but a myriad of them fused together. She then explains to Shallan that she thinks it could be a highly intricate fabrial, and goes on to say that fabrials work by trapping spren and stimulating them to perform specific functions. Now, Jasnah asks Shallan to sketch the jewel configurations, and although Shallan finds it challenging to take orders again, she complies. Jasnah compliments her on what she accomplished during her absence and expresses a desire to be updated on the discovery of Urithiru. When Shallan presses for details on how Jasnah survived, Jasnah simply responds that she is an Elsecaller and explains that her powers allowed her to travel to Shadesmar, though returning was a lot more challenging. She then apologizes for once doubting the usefulness of Shallan's artistic skill, going so far as to actually call herself foolish. Now in this chapter, we get a very detailed sketch of Urithiru, and this time the creepy surrealism is absent, and we even have a Kaladin cameo in the top right, and a very tiny chasm fiend for scale. No notes from Naz this time. Dalinar enters a vision, asking the Stormfather to place Queen Fen in the role of a villager defending his family from the Midnight Essence. Dalinar appears as one of the Radiants, aided by a Windrunner's powers, and he takes the opportunity to ask questions about the shard plate of that era, noticing how it glows, but he's unable to get clear answers. Now, in the role of the villager named Heb, Queen Fen has rallied the other villagers to fight, and she expresses her disbelief that someone with Dalinar's violent history could lead the Reformed Knights Radiant, if their return is even real. And Dalinar makes a very impassioned plea, arguing that she's got little choice but to allow him to come to Thaylen City. Now, his genuine plea actually moves her more than the formal diplomatic language that he had used over Spanreed, and she admits that she had doubted whether it was truly him writing to her. Now that she's seen his sincerity firsthand, she's willing to give him a second chance. We then switch point of view to Sigzil, who wakes up to the sound of Rock's breakfast bell, and after washing and using Stormlight to heal a small cut, he heads to the common room, nearly bumping into Lopen, who's hanging upside down from the ceiling. Now, Sigzil then goes to Kaladin's quarters to discuss pressing issues facing Bridge 4. He points out the battalion lacks officers, scribes, and financial organization, and notes that the group practices a variety of religions. With his Azish training, Sigzil feels compelled to bring order to their operations, and he suggests that they start recruiting. While walking down the hall, they encounter the scout Lyn, and Kaladin offers her a spot in Bridge 4. At first, she's thrilled until Kaladin assigns her to a scribe role. She declines the position, but agrees to try out in Kaladin's upcoming formal trials. As they continue, Sigzil admits that he once tried to become a scholar, but he failed the Azish exams. And Kaladin says that it was a foolish test if they overlooked Sigzil's talents. Now, they arrive at their destination and they check out the entire Royal Emerald Reserve, which they'll be using to practice their newfound Knights Radiant powers. Now, a few interesting details in this chapter. It's really great to see Lyn becoming more of a character here. You may remember in my Words of Radiance summary, I mentioned how Lyn is actually one of Sanderson's beta readers and a moderator for the Stormlight Archive. And she also helped write the Oathbringer reread on the Tor website, Reactor, and that's been such a helpful resource for this video. Imagine the bragging rights you would get from actually being a character in the Stormlight Archive. Another cool detail in this chapter is that there's mention of a man named Pete being betrothed to a woman named Ka, and these are named after Peter Alstrom, Sanders' assistant, and his wife Karen. Now, it's also mentioned that Moash has removed himself from their fellowship, and he's no longer part of Bridge 4. Flashback 24 years ago, Evie is pregnant with Adolin and she encourages Dalinar to find joy in life beyond the battlefield. Dalinar, doubting his ability to change, contemplates seeking out the Nightwatcher. Now later, when speaking with Gavilar, it's revealed that Dalinar never did kill the heir of Tanalan, the boy in the rift, and now the child is grown and has spurred a rebellion in Rathalas. It's being demanded that Dalinar returns the Shardblade. Evie, however, is pleased to learn of the mercy that he showed the child, viewing him as a hero, while Dalinar is shocked by how excited he is at the prospect of killing again. Chapter 37 switches us over to Rock, who's preparing stew for Bridge 4 as they practice being radiant. Nearby, Kaladin instructs them to swear the first ideal, and he helps Hobber learn to breathe in Stormlight, which eventually heals his paralyzed legs. As training progresses, several bridgemen manage to glow with Stormlight, and Lopin gets his face stuck to the ground. Elokar arrives and asks Kaladin to join him in reclaiming Kholinar, and Kal accepts and is given 20 days to prepare his men. Renarin joins them and he questions his place in Bridge 4 since he isn't a Windrunner. Rock insists that he still belongs and he gently directs him to Relaine, who also feels like an outsider. Rock notices a group of Honor Spren watching Bridge 4's training, and he offers Stormlight-infused spheres as an offering, and one human-sized Spren absorbs the light before flying away. In the distance, there's a plume of smoke, and the group sets out to investigate, finding a caravan under attack, and they spot a dead Voidbringer felled by an Unkalaki arrow. Rock recognizes his family finally come to join him, and he introduces them and updates his wife on his failed attempts to win shards from Sadeas. She tells him that something is gravely wrong back in their homeland, and Kaladin promises to find accommodations for Rock's family. Together, Bridge 4 solemnly carries the bridge for the last time, symbolic of their transition from slaves to radiance. Dalinar enters another vision, fighting alongside a group of poorly armed villagers, and when a Stoneward Radiant appears and helps them, the Stormfather explains that Dalinar shares one of the two surges of the Stonewards. He's also shocked to realize that humans fought alongside the Voidbringers in the past. At Dalinar's request, the Stormfather brings Navani and Yasna into the vision, and they witness a Radiant using a fabrial device to perform regrowth. Yasna worries that Dalinar's visions and beliefs might lead to accusations of heresy against him, and she encourages him not to let others define his identity. Climbing a hill, they encounter a grisly sight, thousands of corpses and signs of an ancient desolation. Dalinar is startled to realize that what he thought was a boulder is actually the slain body of a stone-like creature. At the hilltop, they find 9 honor blades embedded in the stone, including the one that killed Gavilar. The Stormfather explains that Odium gave the Voidbringers the power of rebirth through the bodies of the Parshmen, rendering them seemingly undefeatable. To counter this, Honor created the Oath Pact with 10 heralds who would return to damnation after each desolation in order to hold back the spirits of the dead. However, the Oath Pact weakened over time as heralds under torture would eventually break their oaths, leading to increasingly frequent desolations. In the last desolation, only 9 heralds survived, leaving Telenelat, the only herald who never broke, to bear the burden alone. Now, 4,500 years later, the cycle begins again. And this is when Dalinar realizes that the madman from Kholinar is actually the herald Telenelat, though his blade he carried at the Shattered Plains wasn't his honor blade. He wonders if breaking the Oath Pact is what caused the recreants, but the Stormfather refuses to answer, warning that such knowledge could lead Dalinar to abandon his own oaths. Later on in a meeting, the group discusses the Herald's role in past desolations and the sacrifices they made to keep the fused at bay. Kaladin and Yasna debate over how to handle the Parshmen. Kaladin claims they're just as much victims as anyone else, while Yasna views them as potential vessels for the immortal fused. Dalinar sides with Kaladin, and Yasna shocks everyone by proposing they locate the Heralds and kill them to restore the Oath Pact and reseal the fused. Now, oddly, Pattern hints that this room in the basement holds memories, and Shallan thinks that there might be something in Shadesmar. Now, after the meeting, she returns to her room and finds a mysterious letter. The letter contains the promised information from the Ghostbloods, and it reveals information about two groups that are tied to the return of the Voidbringers. The Sons of Honor, led by Gavilar and Amaram, sought to bring about the desolations in order to summon the Heralds and restore the Vorin Church's power. And the Skybreakers, led by the Herald Nail, who hunt down anyone bonded to a spren or on the verge of becoming radiant, believing it would prevent the Voidbringers' return. She learns her brother Helleran was recruited by Nail, but was not fully accepted, and that he may have attempted to kill Amaram to prove his worth, or possibly to eliminate a potential Radiant. She then heads off as Vale and meets up with Gaz and plays a game with the rest of her squires. However, she's interrupted by a spy, Ishna, the woman from earlier who had been so keen to work for the Ghostbloods. Vale gives her a chance to prove herself by training her soldiers to spy. And in this chapter, we get this incredible art by Dan Dos Santos featuring a more traditional Hava, as well as some more daring Alethi fashion trends. We then switch over to Teft, who wakes up in an alley after a night of consuming fire moss. Feeling desolate, he stumbles to a well for water and contemplates dying. Seeing the reflection of a spren in the water, in a fit of anger, he tells it to leave him alone and find someone who cares. He wanders away from the well, unable to face the barracks. The spren reappears, but Teft ignores it and heads back to the fire moss den, indulging in 3 more bowls just to feel functional. He eventually wakes up, head on the table in a puddle of drool, only to find Kaladin and Rock standing over him. Kal asks about his coat, and Teft shamefully admits that he sold it for fire moss. They lead him back to the barracks for stew, and Teft apologizes, promising to let them help him. Though he feels immense shame, he knows his biggest struggle now will be getting through the coming days without fire moss. Storms, but they were good men, better friends than he deserved. They were all growing into something grand, while Teft just stayed on the ground, looking up. Dalinar enters another vision of the last desolation. This time he brings Gox, the prime of Azure. Now you may remember him as Lif's friend from an interlude in the last book. Gox, or Yanagon, is skeptical of Dalinar's motives, and he's wary due to the history of the Sunmaker's brutal rule over Azure. Now Dalinar tries to reassure him, claiming that he's lived long enough to see the consequences of what he's done. Suddenly, Lift appears in the vision, greeting Gox enthusiastically, and she warns him not to trust the Blackthorn before they both vanish from the vision. The Stormfather is flabbergasted at how Lift was able to join the vision, and he claims that the child is tainted by the Nightwatcher, but in a different way than Dalinar. We then get the point of view of Moash, who shivers by a fire out in the middle of the Frostlands with his diagram companions, eating stew that pales in comparison to Rock's cooking. Now, Graves instructs Moash to remove his Bridge 4 patch from his coat, and Moash complies, cutting it off, but keeping it instead of discarding it. He wonders how Kaladin and the other bridge members reacted to his betrayal, feeling shame and regret, and even darker thoughts. Suddenly, the camp is ambushed by 4 Fused, who quickly kill Graves and the others. Moash manages to avoid the initial assault, finding himself facing off against a Fused with Windrunner-like abilities. Remembering Kaladin's training, he kills the Fused, and impressed by his combat prowess, the remaining Fused give him the option to join them and live. Moash, seeing a new path, summons his Shardblade one last time to sever his bond, choosing to accept their offer as they airlift him away. Meanwhile, Vale sits in a tavern with Gaz, Vatha, and Red while Ishna trains them in observation and other espionage techniques, with Vatha showing the most improvement. She then lightweaves back to Shallan and heads off to a meeting with Navani, and when Renarin is mocked for his knowledge of feminine arts, Shallan immediately comes to his defense, throwing an insult back at Janela, and later Renarin thanks her. Then Dalinar shows up and Shallan realizes he's only there to make Renarin feel less awkward. Now here we get some interior artwork from Navani's notebook titled Ship Designs, and if you're wondering about the translation of the women's script, this is what it translates to. Too fanciful, huh? Ask Rushu how to keep the mast from ripping off. Yasna's favorite. And we can assume this is all related to the discussion that Navani is having with the engineer. Now back to Moash, the fused drop him off in the city of Revelar, where he's forced into a pen with the other human captives. He finds an old Carabiner friend who brings him in to meet some revolutionaries, but Moash is immediately turned off by the fact they've chosen a Light Eyes to lead them. The Light Eyes, thinking Moash is useless, beats the man who brought him in, and disillusioned, Moash volunteers for hard labor, accepting his new reality as a slave again. We then briefly switch to Scar, who's weighed down with a full pack as part of Sigzil's test for Bridge 4, and he's frustrated because he lags behind and he still can't draw in Stormlight. Kaladin finally arrives with additional recruits and activates the Oathgate, transporting everyone to Narok. And at Narok, Scar reflects on how the others have had their slave brands healed, but he still has his. Well, everyone but Kaladin. As training begins, Kal sends his squires to practice flying, and Scar notices Lyn standing apart, visibly frustrated with her own struggles to draw in Stormlight. He shares his story with her of how he first saw Kaladin unknowingly use the surge of gravitation to deflect arrows, and Scar suggests that maybe they're both overthinking it and need to focus on a genuine desire to protect. Inspired, Lyn finally draws in Stormlight, her face lighting up with excitement, and though genuinely happy for her success, Scar begins to accept his place in Bridge 4's support team. That is until Rock points out that Scar himself is glowing. Switching to Yasna's point of view, she's reviewing the transcription of the madman's ramblings. The man who claims to be the Herald of War, Talonel. Ivory, her spren, agrees that they need to locate Taln, as he's the one who brought the warning of Odium's intent to destroy humankind and spren alike. She asks Ivory for his opinion on Shallan, and he responds that she is highly unstable, even more so than most humans, and that cryptic spren are particularly troublesome. Yasna considers sharing some crucial information that she learned from Wit with all the others, but Ivory warns her that revealing it could lead to another recreance. Moash had failed Kaladin and the others, but that was merely how men were in this debased age. He couldn't be blamed. He was a product of his culture. Moash, pulling a sledge alongside other humans, marches as an invasion force heading toward Kholinar. He finds himself admiring their sense of order and fairness, except for one group of enslaved Parshmen being whipped and treated harshly. And this is the group that Kaladin had helped earlier. Moash questions his overseer about this mistreatment, and she explains that they had once harbored a false god, a knight radiant among them. One of the exhausted Parshmen stumbles and falls, triggering another round of whipping, and fed up with the cruelty, Moash intervenes, attacking the overseers and taking the injured Parshman's place. After consulting with the fused, the overseer lets the matter go. Another flashback 23 years ago, Dalinar uses Fire Moss to dull his frustration with his new peaceful, battle-free life. A wrestling match breaks out at the bar, and Dalinar feels his old excitement for conflict stirring, until he recalls how close it once brought him to killing Gavilar. When the match is cancelled, Dalinar impulsively takes off his shirt and enters the ring. His opponent backs out, unwilling to face the Blackthorn, and as the den empties, To, his brother-in-law, arrives with news that Evie is in labor. At Evie's side, Dalinar is overjoyed to meet his newborn son. Cradling him, he silently wishes that the boy inherit both his strength and Evie's compassion. He names his son Adolin, meaning born unto light. Later, Gavilar has troubling news. The Rift is in full rebellion, and though he had hoped that Dalinar's mercy toward Tanalan's son would have prevented this, he realizes it's inevitable. Gavilar needs to go back out on a campaign to quell some uprisings. Back in the present, Dalinar, intending on finding and speaking with the madman, flies with Kaladin and a group of squires with Navani at his side. He marvels at Kaladin's skill, which allows him to travel along the edge of a high storm. When they arrive in Narok, Navani and Rushu describe the potential of flying ships, and they're interrupted by a blinking spanreed from Queen Fen, who confirms her visit to Urithiru. The ardent Kadash is skeptical about the madman being a herald, but then a spanreed brings in validation of the translation of the Dawn chant from Dalinar's visions, and it's clear the Ardent is slowly coming around, but he's very wary of where Dalinar's visions are coming from. They then discover that the madman is missing. There's a hole cut into the wall, and oddly a poison dart on the ground. Now after this, Dalinar instructs Kaladin to fly to Thaylen City during the next high storm. Meanwhile, Moash and his team of Parshmen have now reached the outer edge of Kholinar, and when he casually mentions he killed a Fused, Saw is astonished. He sees the Fused sending weak humans to Kholinar, realizing they're attempting to overcrowd the city with refugees. When an overseer sneers that Moash will be at the front running ladders toward the city walls under archer fire, Moash finds dark humor in the irony and bursts into laughter. We then briefly switch to Shallan, who's reading another letter from Mraize, who informs her he did a background check on Ishna and gives her permission to keep working with Shallan. Now, she then meets with Elhokar and offers her services and those of her spies to Elhokar's mission in Kholinar. She plans to use her illusions to disguise the team in order to make it easier to infiltrate. But she's also using the trip as a handy escape from her own troubled mind. Flashback 18 and a half years ago, Dalinar returns to his camp exhausted from 4 years of continuous warfare, first against the Herdasians and now the Vedans along Elithkar's western border. Kadash joins him to report on the recent battle, and he realizes he's secretly pleased that the fighting has dragged on, allowing him to continue feeling the thrill's intoxicating power. And just as he drifts off to sleep, he's awoken by Evie's voice. She's come from Kholinar, wanting to live by his side like other Alethi wives. And despite his irritation at her unexpected arrival, Evie gently reminds him of his duties as a father, noting that Renarin has yet to meet him. Her calmness softens Dalinar's initial anger, and he follows her to see his sons. Adolin is thrilled to see his father, and he even assembled some armor for himself from strings and bits of broken rockbud shells weaved together, and holding a wooden sword, he gives his father a salute, while little Renarin simply watches, preoccupied with blades of grass. For the first time in a long while, Dalinar feels the thrill subside, replaced by a sense of familiar duty. The next chapter switches back to Yasna. She's spending some time with fellow scholars in the bustling library of Urithiru, and she makes a conference call via spanreed to some old friends, who report that they believe the Herald Nail has reappeared and was sighted in Azure. They mention the tale of Lift and Nail in the palace, and Yasna says she will provide them with sketches of the Herald's true faces, provided by an unexpected source. Now, it's likely the source that she's referring to is Hoid, as we know they've been working together since the Epilogue in Words of Radiance. Now, Amaram appears in the doorway, asking to speak privately with her about bridging the gap in their families, and Yasna refuses and verbally dismantles him, making it clear that any relationship was an illusion, and she further insults him by implying his mother was a prostitute. Amaram, enraged, nearly summons his shard blade, but then restrains himself when he sees her hand glowing with stormlight. When he storms off, Shallan praises Yasna's cleverness, then requests permission to leave with Elhokar, reasoning that her skills might be needed if they have to infiltrate the city. Now, Yasna isn't pleased about this, but her attention is drawn to Renarin, who's opened a drawer containing a strange gemstone. They sense a buzzing, musical energy from the gem, and when Renarin infuses stormlight into the wall, hundreds of hidden drawers open, revealing that the library's contents have been meticulously preserved within gemstones, all holding vibration foundational codes containing knowledge thought long lost. Now in this chapter, we get some art with a very interesting calligraphy discussion, and we get to see the glyphs written out for the first ideal of the Knights Radiant. But who exactly wrote this page? Whoever it is, it says, "I prefer bloodstains to ink stains any day, so next time send me somewhere I'm more likely to die from wounds than from hand cramps. By Purity's Eye, if you ask me to draw another glyph." Now we know this person also had to infiltrate the Calligraphers Guild. Obviously they're a world hopper disguised as an ardent. Now I'm gonna mark this as a COSMERE Easter egg, I suppose, but this is of course Naz again. He's writing to Chris. And we know this is Naz because Isaac Stewart always uses the same penmanship when Naz is writing. And he often addresses Chris as my friend. Also, his swearing by Purity's Eye reflects his origin on Threnody, where the outermost planet in the system is called Purity. Moving on to chapter 54, Moash works on building siege ladders alongside Saw and Ken, the parshmen that Kaladin worked with before, and they feel like they're being sacrificed in this coming assault. Moash demands to speak with someone in authority, and a fused flies down and offers to take him to Lady Leshwi. And when he reaches Leshwi, she asks about the origin of his name, explaining that Moash is a name from ancient Parshendi tradition. She identifies herself as one of the Sane Fused and reveals that she was the one that he killed earlier, and that she chooses to spare him because of his fierce passion. Now Moash is stunned to discover that she's the same Fused that was killed, and he also admits he feels undeserving of the shards that were taken from him, and questions the right of humans to rule, confessing that his only real drive is vengeance. Leshwi releases Moash, setting him free, and Moash returns to the lumberyard. Filled with a sense of purpose, he offers to teach them the spear, seeing an opportunity to help them survive. It's almost like he's trying to be Kaladin here, but unfortunately, I think we all know that Moash doesn't have the same honor. Now in this chapter, we also see a voice whispering in Moash's mind, and it's not quite clear yet what's happening, but we can soon piece together that it's likely Odium trying and succeeding at influencing him. We then switch to R'Lain, attuning to the rhythm of the lost as he watches the Alethi reshape his former home, Narok. Feeling like the only true listener left, he notices that while he's trusted enough to wield a spear, he's not trusted to use Stormlight. Even Lyn, a newer recruit, seems to belong more than he does. When he joins some bridgemen at the drink station, they ask him about the recent Fused raid, assuming that he knows the plans of the Fused, and R'Lain explains that the Fused are not his people. His people tried to avoid them, but were tricked into bringing them back. "My people did everything we could to separate ourselves from those creatures. We went into hiding long ago, and swore we would never accept forms of power again. I don't know what changed. My people must have been tricked somehow. In any case, these Fused are as much my enemies as they are yours. More, even. And no, I can't say what they will do. I spent my entire life trying to avoid thinking of them." He wishes Renarin was here, as he's the only one that takes the time to talk with him. Now Kaladin and the patrols return, and Kaladin is surprised by how comfortable the men are with Drehy courting a man, but then they feel uneasy about Renarin working with the scholars because it's seen as feminine. It just doesn't really make sense to him. Now R'Lain sympathizes, noting that humans can't simply choose a form and embrace it as listeners do. Sensing his frustration, Kaladin offers to listen to R'Lain and shows a genuine desire to understand his experience. Now Dalinar brings Navani and Yasna into the vision of the Recreants, where they observe the Knights Radiant driving their shard blades into the ground and abandoning them. Dalinar is struck by the agony of the dying Spren. Now Yanagon, aka Gox, the young emperor, is also part of the vision, and Dalinar uses this time to try to convince him to come to Urithiru. As the vision concludes and everyone leaves, the vision doesn't end for Dalinar. He calls out for the Stormfather and receives no response. Then turning, he sees a man in white and gold, holding a golden scepter. "You're not the Almighty, are you?"
Honor
No, he truly is dead, as you've been told. I'm the other one, Dalinar. They call me Odium. When Dalinar calls Odium a monster for killing Honor, Odium counters by pointing out the violence in Dalinar's own life. Odium reveals his intention to kill Cultivation as well, but he explains that he's currently bound. He mentions that while there's only 3 that are relevant to Dalinar, there are many more like him, which is him referencing all the other shards of Adonalsium. Now, when Dalinar suggests that Odium simply leave the people of Roshar alone, Odium asks if the man holding the remnants of Honor's name and power is offering to release him from his bonds, and he says he will go only if Dalinar does it by intent. Now, Dalinar then tries to understand what Odium is and why he feels the need to destroy. Passion, Dalinar Kholin. I am emotion incarnate. I am the soul of Spren and of men. I am lust, joy, hatred, anger, and exultation. I am glory and I am vice. I am the very thing that makes men men. Odium claims he's not just a god of hate, but a god of passion, caring deeply about people, unlike Honor and Cultivation, who focus on abstract ideals like oaths and transformation. And when asked about what caused the Radiants to abandon their oaths, Odium simply smiles and says that passion, emotion, is what made them break their oaths. At one point, Odium thinks he sees something in the rocks, but he says it must be his mind playing tricks on him. Now, we know this is actually Lift infiltrating Dalinar's vision again. Now, as Odium begins to leave, Dalinar offers a challenge of champions, which Odium declines, confident that Dalinar will eventually free him. Dalinar declares he's no longer afraid of Odium, who just smiles and plunges Dalinar into a powerful vision of his true essence. It was the scream of 1,000 warriors on the battlefield. It was the moment of most sensual touch and ecstasy. It was the sorrow of loss, the joy of victory, and it was hatred, deep pulsing hatred with the pressure to turn all things molten. It was the heat of 1,000 suns. It was the bliss of every kiss. It was the lives of all men wrapped up in one, defined by everything they felt. Dalinar is overwhelmed by the passion and shrinks back and realizes that Odium's old man persona is merely a mask. He then senses the whimpering sound of the Stormfather, who's terrified. Now, before Odium leaves, he looks around the rocks again, and then he disappears, and Lift appears, agreeing to come to Urithiru if the food is good. And as the vision fades, Dalinar is left shaken, realizing the true power he faces in Odium. Now, if you're looking for more details on what Odium was referring to when he was saying the others like them, like Honor, Cultivation, and himself, if you want to know more about the shards of Adonalsium, make sure to watch my video on the origins of the COSMERE. We then move to Interlude 4. Kaza, a soulcaster, journeys with a ship full of sailors to Amia, and the sailors seek treasure in this unknown land, but Kaza seeks only one thing: salvation. The soulcaster that she uses to transform things into smoke is slowly but surely transforming her into the same. And it was said in the old days that people would come to this ancient island to get soulcasters, as the Amians somehow had these devices, and now she seeks a possible cure to her condition. Now suddenly the other sailors fall ill, and she realizes that one of them has poisoned everyone, herself included. She quickly rows to the shore as her strength is rapidly fading, and collapsing on the shore, she passes an uncut gemstone amidst the bones of a great shell, and the ship's cook approaches her, and Kaza understands that he poisoned the whole crew to prevent them from learning the island's secret. Now, in her final moments, Kaza asks what secret the island holds, and the cook, revealed to be a Dacian Amian, warns her that the truth is dangerous dangerous enough to end worlds. His body falls apart into an army of Kremlings that attempt to take Kaz's soulcaster, and with her last strength, she turns the ground and herself into smoke, escaping into oblivion. Now, the Dacian Aemeans, also known as the Sleepless, are a very strange race on Roshar. They're made up of creatures called Hordlings that are mentally linked. Basically, they're like a giant hive mind, and they once lived in the Silver Kingdom of Aemea. What the goal of the Sleepless is a mystery as of yet, but one interesting detail is that the blurbs on the back covers of the Stormlight Archive books, they're all written from an in-universe perspective and are authored by the Sleepless. So with that knowledge, go pick up your books and read the synopsis on the back cover, because yeah, it's interesting. Interlude 5. Taravangian is having a genius day, though he realizes he's not quite as intelligent as the day he created the diagram. Frustrated by his earlier interpretations, he cuts the diagram into pieces, rearranging sections to gain new insights. He discovers connections he had missed before, which deepens his understanding. Reflecting on his life, he recalls how people had once assumed he was mentally diminished because he was born with his umbilical cord around his neck. Now, after hours of revising the diagram, he finally realizes that it's past the point to kill Dalinar. Now they must side with him until they can make a move and Taravangian can take his place, so he can negotiate directly with Odium. They plan to use Malata's Spren to gather intelligence on Dalinar's weaknesses. Now, Taravangian concludes that defeating Odium is impossible. His purpose is to save what they can. And then Interlude 6. Venli waits anxiously for the Everstorm with 8 others, including Demid, her friend and former mate. Guided by the Voidspren Ulim, they've been selected for a significant transformation and must fully surrender to the storm to receive great power. Now, as the Everstorm strikes, Venli feels an alien force pressing against her soul, demanding entry. Overwhelmed by pain, she hears a comforting voice claiming, "This one is mine," and then something else enters her. When the storm subsides, Venli examines her new form, noticing that it's slimmer and less muscular than the others. Now, some of the others appear deranged, and they speak in an unfamiliar language. Demid, now transformed, does not recognize her, and he treats her with disdain. Ulim explains that her companions are now fused, and their bodies are taken over by the souls of ancient gods. Demid's body is now inhabited by Heriel, a notoriously vicious fused. Heartbroken, Venli pleads to bring Demid back, but Ulim tells her it's impossible, even for Odium. As the fused converse in their strange tongue, Venli senses a small ball of light, like the one she saw near Eshonai's body. She hides it from the others, sensing this strange spren is something she must protect. And that ends part 2, but we need to quickly mention all the chapter epigraphs for part 2. If we piece them all together, the epigraphs form 3 letters. The first and the second are directed to Safendrius, and the third is addressed to Friend, which is also likely referring to Safendrius. Now, there is a lot of COSMERE connections here. I'm going to cover all of this briefly, so skip ahead to part 3 if you don't want to know. Okay, first of all, Safendrius is one of the oldest aliases of Hoid. The first letter is written by Endowment, the shard located on Nalthis, and this letter dismisses Safendrius, or Hoid, for meddling in the affairs of the shards. Endowment expresses disdain for Hoid's interference, and she references the destruction of Aeona and Sky, which are the shard holders of devotion and dominion, and she warns him to stay out of matters concerning Reyes, the shard holder of Odium. Now, Endowment's tone is condescending, and she reminds Hoid that he turned his back on divinity, implying that Reyes will be dealt with if necessary. And then the second letter comes from an avatar of autonomy located on Taldane. The writer is very cryptic and distant, emphasizing independence and and disdain for Hoid's approach. They mention their domain, Abrodai, cautioning Hoid to avoid it, as an avatar there has been imbued with a strong dislike of him. The letter then concludes with a challenge, suggesting that Hoid must prove himself by overcoming their tests if he seeks further communication for aid. And then the third letter. This one is very interesting. It is going to have some spoilers for Mistborn, so again, I do urge you to skip ahead if you want to avoid it. The third letter is written by Harmony, and we know by the end of Mistborn Era 1 that Harmony is Sazed, who's now the dual shard holder of Preservation and Ruin. Now, Harmony is much more open, yet uncertain, acknowledging his struggles with balancing the conflicting powers that he holds. He expresses curiosity about Hoid's knowledge of Adonalsium, and he's puzzled by Hoid's ability to conceal himself. Harmony then invites Hoid to engage with him directly and honestly, offering to help Hoid if Hoid returns to his lands and speaks with his agents. Okay, that ends part 2 and the COSMERE spoilers. Moving on to part 3. This covers chapters 58 to 87 and interludes 7 to 11. Dalinar waits by the Oathgate to Thaylen City, unsettled by his recent encounter with Odium and the memory of the Stormfather whimpering in fright. Soon, Shallan and Kaladin arrive through the Oathgate after having opened it from the other side. Now, Dalinar informs Kaladin that as a shard bearer, when the war is over, he's been gifted lands by the king and people to manage as a Bright Lord. But Kaladin finds the added responsibility to be more of a burden, but he's reminded that speaking the words meant he willingly took on such duties. Malata activates the gate and the group is transported back to Thaylen City. Dalinar is shocked by the sheer scale of the destruction that the Everstorm caused, and he follows Queen Fen as she takes them on a tour. Now, she leads them to the Temple of Shalash, and Dalinar wonders how the Everstorm managed to destroy parts of the statue's faces inside the building. Now, take note of this detail, as you may remember in the last book, we were made aware that Shalash is going around destroying paintings and statues of her own face. So clearly the Herald has already visited this temple. At the Temple of Bata, they've made a makeshift hospital, and Taravangian offers some of his surgeons to help aid the injured. They end the tour at the courtyard of Telenalat, where Fen excuses herself, and seeing an opportunity to make an impression, Dalinar challenges a soldier, Fen's son, to a duel, proposing a unique match in which each will take turns being unarmed for 3 minutes, and first blood wins. Now, Dalinar is first to go unarmed, and he skillfully avoids his opponent's strikes until the last few seconds when he purposefully steps into a thrust. He heals the stab wound with Stormlight, and he concedes the duel, leaving the onlookers astonished and slightly fearful. Wandering off, Dalinar rests against the crumbling temple walls, and he hears voices calling for unity. Realizing the voices come from the wounded stones, he draws in all his Stormlight, and he repairs the temple's front wall. Queen Fen is very surprised to see that Dalinar has fixed the temple, and Renarin is also helping heal some of the wounded. Fen finally agrees to join Dalinar's coalition and promises to help gain the support of the Azish as well. And here we get this beautiful interior artwork showcasing some Thaylen fashion. We finally switch over to Kaladin, who flies above the high storm with Elokar's team, heading towards Kholinar. Now, Shallan in particular feels very at ease and excited about flying, and seeing her joy makes Kaladin tempted to show her how to really fly. Now, after learning about her secrets during their trip in the chasms, he wonders how she manages to smile like that, and it seems like he's almost thinking of her romantically here, before he banishes the silly daydreams, but not without Syl teasing him for noticing the way that he looks at her. Now, scouting the city, he sees that it still has Alethi flags, but he feels an eerie wrongness darkness around the palace and the Oathgate platform beside it. Elhokar is eager to go directly to the palace. After all, his wife and child are inside and they may be in danger. But Kaladin advises caution, with Adolin supporting him, and they ultimately agree to take a more subtle approach, entering Kholinar in disguise using Shallan's light-weaving abilities. Now, here we also get this detailed map of Kholinar, which is roughly symmetrical in shape. Is it just me, or does it kind of look like it's in the shape of a glyph? Now, Kaladin and Adolin are transformed into elderly men, with Kaladin appearing very ugly and wizened, and Adolin lean and attractive. She jokingly tells Elhokar that he'll be disguised as a woman, and surprising everyone, he accepts with no complaint, focused on getting into the city and getting to his family. Now, they all notice how the city seems to be in shadow, even with no clouds in the sky. And Shallan, having sketched an odd, twisted, and distorted version of the palace, believes that there's an unmade nearby. As they approach, Elhokar expresses doubts about his abilities, and he asks Kaladin to ensure his wife and his son escape through the Oathgate. Adolin knows a safe place near the palace where they can gather information. At the city gate, they find soldiers restricting entry under the orders of High Marshal Azure. Now, Syl suddenly flies off as Voidbringers approach the city. The guards rush off to defend, and the team seizes the chance to blend in with the refugees entering the city and head toward Adolin's tailor's shop. Along the way, they see strange Spren and an unsettling procession of performers dressed and acting like Spren. Shallan removes their disguises, and inside the tailor shop, she tries to draw pain Spren by injuring herself, but struggles until she stabs herself with scissors, finally attracting them. And to her shock, the pain Spren are twisted and green instead of the usual orange. Now, Yakska, the tailor, updates Elhokar on the city's troubling situation, including his wife's increasingly erratic behavior. Yakska complains how the city was full of riots and that the queen had ordered the Parshman's execution, but influential Light Eyes intervened, resulting in the Parshmen being exiled beyond the city walls. Now, the queen also executed Ardents who questioned her, and after the Everstorm hit, the city was coated in gloom, and things got much worse. Bright Lords who went to speak to the queen never returned. Now, to attract shame Spren, Shallan contemplates something embarrassing and ends up exposing her safe hand sleeve and her legs, causing altered shame Spren to appear. Yakska continues, explaining that a new High Marshal arrived and restored some order. But the Cult of Moments, a fanatical group who dress up like Spren, effectively rule the city. This cult insists that a new time is coming, one which Spren will rule the world. Also, we learn that any Fabrial used in the city summons yellow void Spren, which call the fused to confiscate them. Determined to help his family, Elhokar decides to send a sealed message to his wife through Shallan disguised as a messenger, and Kaladin plans to accompany her as protection. And Shallan, transforming into Veil, finally reveals her alter ego to her squires. Later, she wanders the refugee-filled streets, and as she gets closer to the palace, she senses an ominous feeling, and she changes her appearance to resemble Lyn, remaining in her Veil persona. She approaches the Oathgate, now guarded by cultists, and she hears disturbing noises from the platform. She finds Kaladin, who gives her the letter from Elhokar, and I should note that Veil is attracted to the brooding man. She doesn't seem to understand why Shallan likes Adolin. Anyway, she decides to go alone to avoid risking both of them, but she assures Cal she'll send Pattern if she gets in trouble. She approaches the palace guards and announces that she has a letter for the queen, but one of the guards suddenly stabs her, and then pretending to die, Veil uses just enough stormlight to survive as they carry her inside. Passing a mirror, she glimpses a shadowy figure with white eyes staring at her in surprise. Veil is placed in a room with decaying bodies, and she escapes by disguising herself as a servant. She gets Pattern to fetch Kaladin, and after checking her wounds, they make their way back to the safe house, but Shallan is very, very shaken. Smile. I need you to smile. I need what happened to be all right. Something that can simply roll off me. Please. Well, Kaladin said, I'm glad we took a stab at this anyway. He smiled. It was all right. Just another day, another infiltration. And then back to Dalinar, who retrieves Jezrien's honor blade and questions the Stormfather about the whereabouts of the other heralds. The Stormfather is reluctant, but eventually reveals that he knows Ishar's location. And Dalinar realizes that Ishar is actually Tezim, the crazed warlord and god priest in Tukar. The Stormfather explains that Dalinar possesses the power of Ishar, the binder of gods, giving him the ability to create connection. There's only 2 others who have similar powers, inherited from his siblings. He decides to give the Honor Blade to Bridge 4 so they can practice while Kaladin's away, and then Dalinar insists on traveling to Azure alone despite the risk. When he arrives in Azure, he's met by a large group of soldiers and viziers, and after speaking with the Stormfather, he realizes he can use spiritual adhesion, creating a connection that allows him to understand and speak in their language. He doesn't need Duolingo. Dalinar then presents essays from Navani, Yasna, and Queen Fen, and the officials are especially impressed by Yasna's essay, praising it as a work of art. All the viziers and ardents are impressed, and he's invited to wait while they consult the Prime and his council. And in the waiting room, Dalinar finds that his food has already been partially eaten by none other than Lift. Yes, Lift stole Dalinar's lunch. Dalinar realizes that she's an edge dancer, and Lift observes that he smells like the Nightwatcher. Now, the lead vizier, Nura, returns with the news that the Azish have accepted his proposal to visit Urithiru, and she expresses surprise at Dalinar's diplomacy, admitting she expected a war-hardened animal. Her words trigger a memory in Dalinar, and upon returning to Urithiru, he suddenly recalls everything about the destruction of the Rift. Flashback 11 years ago. Dalinar is schooling Adolin on the ways of war when Evie arrives and reads a letter from Gavilar, assigning him to address the rebellion at the Rift. Now, Evie is distressed by the thought of another campaign. She scolds Dalinar for his prolonged absence, especially from their son Renarin, whom Dalinar rarely considers due to his disability. Dalinar wants to stay on the warpath for the rest of his life, and when Evie breaks down, he grudgingly admits defeat, and he agrees to head back to Kholinar for a year after the Battle of the Rift. Switching back to Shallan, she's mostly recovered, but she's still troubled by the image of the Unmade that she saw in the mirror. Elhokar outlines a plan. Shallan will infiltrate the Cult of Moments to get close to the Oathgate, and if she fails, Elhokar and Adolin will rally the Light-Eyed Houses for an assault on the palace. Meanwhile, Kaladin is to investigate the Wall Guard and its mysterious leader, Azure. And when Adolin compliments Elhokar on this strategy, Elhokar creates a glory spread. Now, Shallan as Vale goes for a walk through the marketplace, and she discovers that the rich Light Eyes are prioritizing giving food to the rich over the poor. She then hears a familiar voice, and she approaches to find Wit entertaining a crowd with a story about the moon, Mishim. He's creating images out of colorful smoke, and Shallan wonders if he's light weaving, but she saw no stormlight. And she mentions how there's something more organic about what he's doing. Now, in the story, a renowned architect, Queen Sa of Natanatan, was visited one night by Mishim, the cleverest moon, who praised her high towers to disguise her true intent. Longing to experience mortal pleasures, Mishim attempts to convince Sa to switch places. And for 3 nights, Sa resisted, but on the 4th, Mishim appealed to her vanity, and then Sa agrees to switch. Mishim delighted in mortal life, but then when dawn came, she realized she'd stayed too long. Fearing Sa would reveal her trick to Salis or Nomon, the other 2 moons, Mishim fretted through the day, and when night fell, Sa refused to return, enchanted by the heavens. Desperate, Mishim reminded her of their agreement, and Sa reluctantly resumed her place on Earth. But then, 9 months later, Queen Sa gave birth to a blue-skinned child. Mishim, watching from the skies, realized that Sa had planned it all along, to spend a night with Nomon and bear a child of the gods. And that is why to this day, the people of Natanatan have skin of a faintly blue shade. And it is why Mishim, though still crafty, has never again left her place. Most importantly, it is the story of how the moon came to know the one thing that before mortals had only known: loss. Now I should note, there's a moment when Wit looks back to his pack and then he's surprised before jumping back into the story with ease, but he carefully scans the crowd before resting his eyes on Shallan, and she's surprised that he noticed her even when she's disguised as Vale. And Shallan briefly sees a jar of black sand in his pack that's white on the side facing her before he closes it. And yes, you guessed it, this is going to be a COSMERE Easter egg, so skip ahead maybe 30 seconds if you don't want to know. Now, the jar of sand in his pack is from the planet Taldane, from white sand. And basically the way that it works is when it's drained, it's black, but it can get charged up with investiture and turn white. So this makes it a good way to detect investiture. And to quote Sanderson himself, if you can keep the little beasties that are growing on the sand around, they will react to basically the investiture equivalent of radiation. So when Hoid noticed the sand was white, he was alerted to Shallan's light weaving. And yes, we also saw a jar of this sand in the trophy room of the Ghostbloods in Words of Radiance. Also, the light weaving that Wit was using, involving the colorful smoke to illustrate the story, this is Yolish light weaving, which we don't really know much about other than that it existed before the Shattering. And it comes from the COSMERE planet where humans first appeared, Yolen. And Yolen is also the homeworld of the original vessels, along with Hoid and Frost. Now, I'm not sure why his own light weaving didn't turn the sand white, but maybe his use of investiture is a lot more practiced, and so it doesn't bleed out into the environment. Okay, COSMERE spoilers over. Now, once he finishes telling the story, Vale wonders why he told that story, and Wit says that he doesn't give the meanings, he just tells the tale. Now, the story seems to be a cosmology fairy tale about the blue skin of the Natan people, which we do know is actually due to some Sia Aemean blood. And you may remember the only known Sia Aemean in the story is Axes the Collector. Now, Wit then says that she should buy him a meal, and later at the tavern, they're settled in a private dining area, and Wit compliments her disguise, acknowledging her talent for blending in. And Shallan wonders aloud if Wit is a herald, and he responds, "Heavens no, I'm not stupid enough to get mixed up in religion again. The last 7 times I tried it were all disasters. I believe there's at least one god still worshipping me by accident." Now, I wonder if this remark here is referring to the Court of Gods on Nalthis. She presses him more on what he is, and then he says, "Some men, as they age, grow kinder. I am not one of those, for I have seen how the COSMERE can mistreat the innocent, and that leaves me disinclined toward kindness. Some men, as they age, grow wiser. I am not one of those, for wisdom and I have always been at cross purposes, and I have yet to learn the tongue in which she speaks. Some men, as they age, grow more cynical. I, fortunately, am not one of those. If I were, the very air would warp around me, sucking in all emotion, leaving only scorn. Other men, as they age, merely grow stranger. I fear that I'm one of those. I am the bones of a foreign species left drying on the plain that was once, long ago, a sea. A curiosity, perhaps a reminder, that all has not always been as it is now." He then goes on to explain that he's much older than the heralds. "Child, when they were but babes, I had already lived dozens of lifetimes. Old is a word you use for worn shoes. I'm something else entirely." Shallan catches a glimpse of shadows playing in his eyes, shapes that moved and were worn down by time. She sees a timelessness in his eyes, and for some reason, he's opening up to Shallan, letting her know that he's not what she thinks he is. He then explains how when he was young, he made a vow to always be there when he was needed. Now, their conversation then turns to other matters, and Wit is surprised to discover that Sadeas is dead, saying that he would have applauded. They then speak of Shallan's ambitions to open the Oathgate and to save the city and to change the world. Wit warns her to be cautious with power and wary of anyone who claims to predict the future. When Shallan asks about the cult near the Oathgate, Wit reveals that the Unmade, known as the Heart of the Revel, resides there, and each night, cult members feast excessively, and Wit advises Shallan to obtain real, non-soulcast food if she wishes to infiltrate. He then claims that the cult reminds him of a dangerous and foolish group that he knew long ago. Now, slight COSMERE spoiler here, I think he's possibly referring to the original vessels who planned out and fulfilled in killing Adonalcium, and Wit was actually a part of it somehow, but he didn't take up a shard. Wit then abruptly leaves, and Shallan asks Pattern if he knows who Wit is. Pattern oddly replies that Wit feels like one of us. Now, meanwhile, Kaladin subtly infuses a small stone with stormlight, triggering the unnatural screeching of the twisted spren that hunt for surge binding, determining that using his lashes are out of the question. The team all head back to the tailor shop to change their disguises. The men are off to a party to gather intel, with Elhokar and Adolin planning to seek light-eyed allies. And Kaladin, not interested in the whole party thing, decides to scope out the wall guard and search for High Marshal Azure. When he reaches the barracks, a guard stops him and, noting his brand, invites him in for stew. This man, a lieutenant named Noro, along with a man named Beard, share tales of Azure, who apparently rallied the wall guard against the Cult of Moments with an unusual shard blade. When Azure enters to make her nightly rounds, Kaladin is surprised to realize that she's a woman, and he senses a sort of timelessness to her, and he can't quite place her age. Now, Azure encourages him to join the guard, citing the stability of food and purpose. She then leads him to the wall and further tries to convince him to join, saying that unlike Sadeas's army, here he would be fighting to truly defend people from the Voidbringers. Kaladin remains undecided, and later he returns and tells the team that he suspects Azure may be another Radiant. 11 years ago, Dalinar marches towards the Rift. He rides near Evie's wagon, where she prays and burns incense, pleading for him to spare lives. Wanting to mend their strained relationship, Dalinar joins her in the wagon, where she expresses her fear of the transformation that she sees in him during battle, especially when the thrill takes over. I see beauty in you, Dalinar Kholin. I see a great man struggling against a terrible one. And sometimes you get this look in your eyes, a horrible, terrifying nothingness, like you have become a creature with no heart, feasting upon souls to fill that void, dragging pain spren in your wake. It haunts me, Dalinar. Desiring to make her happy, Dalinar approaches Tanalan and offers him the chance to surrender, or at least resolve the battle through a duel to minimize the bloodshed. However, Tanalan declines, and he offers a different solution. He claims there's a traitor among the loyal High Princes, and he says if they pretend to have been secret allies, they could draw out any disloyal High Princes who may support a false rebellion and be willing to betray King Gavilar. And all Dalinar needs to do is capture the caravan that just left a few hours ago. And it's hinted that Sadeas is in this very caravan. Now, moving over to Vale, who along with Vatha infiltrate a mansion, while Red scouts ahead. She finds a storeroom and intimidates a servant to gain access, allowing Vatha to gather food. However, they're discovered before they can get away. Vale scares some of the guards with her illusions, then she's shot in the head with a crossbow bolt, causing her face illusion to start melting, terrifying the guards, who all scatter. Vatha pulls the bolt out of her head as Vale draws in Stormlight to recover, and she heads to the market to distribute food to the needy, including her contact, Grund. She hopes that her actions will attract the attention of the Cult of Moments. Meanwhile, Kaladin, having joined the Wall Guard, asks Beard how the city is being supplied, and Beard mentions a soulcaster obtained from a monastery, which the Screamers somehow failed to detect. They also discuss Azure's odd shard blade that has no gemstone, and Kaladin thinks it could be an honor blade like that of the assassin in white, and he wonders if it gives her the powers of soul casting. Now back to Vale, she's distributing food to the needy, building a reputation as the Swift Spren, a mysterious figure who steals from the rich to help the poor. And she enhances this persona by sending Ishna and Vatha in illusions that resemble Vale. Then, spotting a Cult of Moments procession, she joins in, and she creates a new illusion and becomes a very convincing Spren, so much so that the cultists begin kneeling around her. She then hears a voice in her mind say, "Shallan, I am not your enemy." Startled, she breaks free of the group and urges the cultists to stop worshipping Spren and return home, telling them that the Dark Ones they follow are lying to them. And then, hearing genuine laughter nearby, she finds Wit leading a group in song, providing a brief, refreshing moment of levity. Now, returning to the tailor's shop, Vale struggles to become Shallan again, as Vale's persona wants to stay and flirt with Kaladin, though Radiant denies this idea, claiming her oaths to Adolin are important. She tries to remember what Shallan wanted, but figures why bother worrying about her. Now later, she sketches an idealized image of Elokar, dignified and regal, which moves him deeply. Then she heads to her room, where Ishna hands her a note inviting her to join the Revel. We then get another flashback 11 years ago. Dalinar leads a group of archers to ambush the caravan. However, he falls directly into a trap. A landslide decimates his troops and leaves his shard plate nearly shattered. Overcome by the thrill, he claws his way from the rubble, seeing an unsettling gleam in the eyes of the soldiers who surround him before they attack. Now, Dalinar loses himself in the battle, only regaining his senses as he smashes a soldier's head repeatedly, surrounded by fallen bodies. Severely injured and his plate barely holding together, he trudges back to camp, where his men are shocked to see him alive. He realizes it was all a setup. Furious, Dalinar and Sadeas reject the idea of a siege, and instead they want total retribution on the city's people, men, women, and children alike. Evie tries to calm Dalinar, but he coldly orders the Soulcaster to produce as much oil as possible. His plan, to burn the city to the ground. Later, messengers emerge from the city bearing a white flag, but Dalinar orders them shot down. They then attack at night, and despite Taleb's concerns for the innocents, Dalinar orders oil poured onto the city, housing tens of thousands of people, setting it aflame. And as fire spreads, Dalinar targets a safe room outside the city where he suspects Tanalan is hiding. Ignoring the screams within, he sets the safe room ablaze. He then spots Tanalan trying to reach the palace to save his family, and he watches as the palace collapses. And just before Dalinar executes him, Tanalan reveals a horrific truth. The messengers that Dalinar killed were actually sent to warn him that his wife Evie had been imprisoned in the safe room, which he just burned. Realizing the devastating mistake, Dalinar, furious and heartbroken, ends Tanalan's life. Kadash is sickened and horrified at Dalinar's actions, and Dalinar then orders the remaining soldiers to search the safe room, but it's too late. Evie's burned body is eventually recovered and secretly prepared for burial. Dalinar orders the scribes to rewrite the story, saying she was assassinated and the city was burned in retribution. He leaves, haunted by the screams that he heard. Shallan says she's found information from a book on two unmade in the city. Shah Anat, the taker of secrets, the one who corrupts Spren, and a Shurtmarn, the heart of the Revel, who drives people into excess. At one point, Kaladin flicks away an odd Kremling with a strange pattern on it, and this is actually a hidden detail. This Kremling is one of the Dacian Aemeans, also called the Sleepless, the same type of creature that confronted the Soulcaster Kaza. Clearly, it's been spying on them, which makes you really wonder what their motives are. Now later, Adolin is looking at Shallan's sketches and he finds one of himself, but before he can turn the page, she quickly retrieves the sketchbook to hide the next drawing, which is of Kaladin. She then prepares for another food heist, and Vatha unintentionally uses Stormlight to disguise himself, shocking him and leaving him near tears as he realizes that he may be a budding Radiant. Now in this chapter, we get some interior art that's an art piece from Hessi's Mythica, the book with info on the Unmade that Shallan found. And it claims that Shah Anat seeks the children of honor and the children of cultivation, and with one touch, she corrupts. Also a really cool detail, it's surrounded by depictions of some of the corrupt Spren. In the next chapter, Vale arrives at the Oathgate Plaza and presents her offering, thereby gaining access to the platform and the revelers on it. She convinces them that she hears a voice urging her to embrace the time of the Spren. She manages to slip into the inner circle, and here she sees people crawling around, overcome with various emotions, and the food on the table is rotten. She feels the pull of indulgence, but she snaps out of it thanks to Pattern's hum. She then heads toward the control building, finding it covered in a dark, unnatural, pulsating mass of goo. This is when she realizes her shadow moving in the wrong direction, crawling up the wall with eyes like white holes glowing faintly, and the shadow tells her, "I'm not your enemy, but the heart is a trap. Take caution." It seems that Shah Anat isn't exactly working with the other Unmade, the Heart of the Revel, which is more mindless than she is. Now alarm drums sound as the city falls under attack, prompting her to escape the platform. Meanwhile, Kaladin is watching atop the wall, sensing that something is wrong. Azure is boosting the group's morale, and she begins questioning him about his background. They have some back and forth as they both subtly test each other, and when she asks Kaladin how he ended up in the city, he simply replies, "I flew." Now suddenly the Fused attacks and Kaladin tries to take command. When a Fused lashes him, Kaladin manages to redirect his fall without Stormlight. He then leaps back into the air, grabbing hold of a Fused, and in an aerial struggle he stabs it with a Sill knife. And Kaladin, piercing hard, feels a brittle area that kills the Fused. They crash back on the wall, and Kaladin's forced to use Stormlight to heal his injuries. Reporting to Azure, she reveals that an entire army of Voidbringers is advancing, and this is when Kaladin reveals he's a Radiant. The woman studied him, and reluctantly, Kaladin summoned Sill as a Shardblade. Noro's eyes bulged, and Ved nearly fainted, though Beard just grinned. "I'm here," Kaladin said, resting the Sill blade on his shoulder. "On orders from King Elokar and the Blackthorn. It's my job to save Kholinar, and it's time you started talking to me." Now it's also time I bring up a COSMERE Easter egg regarding who Azure really is. This is going to be a Warbreaker spoiler, so again, skip ahead a bit if you do want to avoid it. It is a pretty big one. So at one point during the fight, Kaladin sees Azure with her cloak off, and it's oddly wrapped around her forearm. Not to mention, we've also seen her use a few colorful metaphors, just like Xyle. Even the name, Azure, is a subtle clue that she's not really from Roshar, but rather Nalthis. Now, I don't blame you if you didn't pick up on it, but Azure's true identity is actually Vivenna from Warbreaker. And just like how Vasher awakens his cloak with the command, "Protect me," in the prologue of Warbreaker, Azure was definitely awakening her cloak, most likely to use it as some sort of shield during the battle. Now, in Warbreaker, Vivenna's awakened cloak also grabs and then drops an arrow that someone shot at her, and Vasher's cloak fights multiple opponents on its own. Also, according to Brandon, her strange blade is invested and Azure has awakened it. And Sanderson has said that if Azure's sword was wielded against Nightblood, terrible things would happen, but Nightblood would be the stronger of the pair. He also confirms that Vasher, or Xyle, is aware of the blade. Okay, that's the end of the Easter egg. Kaladin asks how they've been soulcasting food without drawing the attention of the Voidspren, and Azure leads him to a hidden room where two soulcasters are converting stone into grain. She explains that a man who Kaladin realizes was Wit provided special metal sheets that block the screamers from detecting the soulcasting. And pause. If you want to know what this metal is, this is yet again another COSMERE Easter egg. So, skip ahead 30 seconds if you don't want to know. But the metal that Wit or Hoid provided is aluminum. And aluminum has some very bizarre properties in the COSMERE. For instance, on Scadrial, you can't affect it with allomancy. In fact, burning aluminum makes your metal reserves vanish, but a feruchemist can use it to store identity. And if used as a hemalurgic spike, aluminum removes all powers. And over on Nalthis, this metal can't be awakened. Nightblood's sheath is actually made out of aluminum. And here on Roshar, you can soulcast stuff into aluminum, but you can't soulcast aluminum into anything else. And it can also block span-read communication. Basically, it acts as an investiture block. Anyway, back to the chapter. Kaladin explains to Azure the plan to activate the Oathgate and to transport the Alethi army waiting outside. Meanwhile, Vale returns to the people she's been supplying food to, only to learn that her good deed has backfired tremendously, and she's made the people into victims, especially young Grund, who dies at the hand of the street toughs who have been stealing all the food from them after Vale leaves. Now, this causes Shallan to have an emotional breakdown where she begins cycling through her countless personas, hoping to find one that can bear the pain. Wit then arrives, and in his usual blunt but compassionate way, he tells her that failure is a part of life, and that she didn't deserve the hardships that she's faced. He then uses his illusions to tell her a story. The Girl Who Looked Up. This is the same story Shallan told with Lightweaving back in Urithiru, but Wit is continuing it. He says it's a story from long ago, during a different time when a wall kept out the storms. Breathing at the dust on the floor, he creates a figure of a girl standing before a wall before it disintegrates, and he asks Shallan for some help. Using Stormlight, she creates an illusion, painting the walls and the ceiling, an illusion that's stronger than any other she's made. Then Wit adjusts the illusion to make it darker, telling her that in those days there was no light. They had to live by starlight. They get to the part of the story when the girl climbs up the wall, and Shallan repeats how the girl discovers the wall was to keep her people out. Wit stepped over to Shallan, then quietly folded his arms around her. She trembled, then twisted, burying her face in his shirt. "You're not a monster, Shallan," Wit whispered. "Oh, child. The world is monstrous at times, and there are those who would have you believe that you are terrible by association. No, for you see, it flows the other direction. You're not worse for your association with the world, but it is better for its association with you." He then continues the story, creating a powerful explosion of brightness as the girl in scarves discovers God's light on the other side of the wall, and she brings it back to dispel the darkness for her people, followed by the coming of the storms boiling over the wall. After the story, he advises Shallan to live and let her failures be part of her. He creates two illusions of Shallan, one who collapses broken, and another who stands, choosing to live on and forgive herself. Your other minds take over because they look so much more appealing. You'll never control them until you're confident in returning to the one who birthed them, until you accept being you. He tells her that she is worth protecting and that she should accept the pain, but shouldn't accept that she deserves it. Inspired, Shallan embraces her strength and returns to the shop, where she finds Adolin anxiously awaiting her. And just then, Kaladin and Azure arrive with an army and announce to Elokar that they're ready to make their move on the palace and retake the city. As they approach, the city walls come under attack and a massive thunderclast scales the walls, sweeping soldiers aside and hurling a boulder toward them. Kaladin flies up to intercept it, lashing it back, but he misses. Now Adolin and Elokar's shard blades carve a path into the palace, while Azure slices enemy spears with her shorter blade. As he watched, she stabbed an enemy soldier who tried to push through. His eyes didn't burn, though his skin did go a strange ashen gray as he died. Blood of my fathers, Adolin thought. What's wrong with her shard blade? As the fighting intensifies, Adolin begins to hear a voice exulting in the battle's thrill, feeding off his passion for combat. Meanwhile, Kaladin and his squires appear, glowing with stormlight, and they secure the gallery. Now, they end up finding a small group of palace guards who didn't fall under the sway of the Unmade. And oddly, these guards believe they've only been locked up for a few days, and not weeks. And it appears there's been some sort of time dilation going on with the effects of the Unmade. Now, Elhokar leads the group, including Kaladin, to the royal chambers, where they encounter palace guards who seem to be under a spell. Elhokar manages to break their trance and they retreat, and then inside, they hear Aesudan, the queen, singing in an eerie voice, possessed by Yelignar. As Elhokar keeps his distance but tries to reason with Aesudan, she reveals her true allegiance. She dismisses Elhokar as a fool, boasting about her connection to ancient Spren. Now, Kaladin finds Gavinor terrified and cowering in a corner under attack from strange red Spren. And Kaladin, filled with rage, stabs one of these Spren, and Syl is shocked by the realization that he may have just killed a Spren. Now, Aesudan's eyes glow red and she declares her loyalty to Odium, commanding her soldiers to attack as Elhokar gathers up Gavinor to flee. Meanwhile, Shallan and Adolin move towards the Oathgate platform, ready to face the Unmade, and Shallan approaches the grotesque purple heart of the Unmade blocking the Oathgate. She tries to destroy it with her shard blade, but to no avail. And desperate, she reaches out and touches the heart of the Revel with her hand, and a torrent of emotions sweep over her. The Unmade begins to feed on Shallan's emotions, begging for her to give it her passion. Shallan's personas splinter, each embodying a different feeling, and then Wit's voice cuts through the chaos, reminding her that she can embrace all these identities. They rule me, Wit, Veil, and Radiant, and all the others. They're consuming me. Then be ruled as a king is ruled by his subjects. Make Shallan so strong, the others must bow. Shallan screams, and the Unmade, the heart of the Revel, recoils, becoming sludge and melting away. And Shallan sees a strange woman in the mirror who introduces herself as Shah Anat, once called the Taker of Secrets. Now, Shah Anat, the Unmade, claims that she no longer is loyal to Odium, and she insists that she's not Shallan's enemy. She warns Shallan that she was forced to tamper with the Spren controlling the Oathgate, turning it into a deadly trap. And she begs Shallan not to activate it. Kaladin tries to hold back the Queen's troops, but he can't, and as he descends the stairs, he hears familiar Parshendi voices singing. One of them is Saw, his friend from his time with the Parshmen. In that moment, Kaladin lost something precious. He'd always been able to trick himself into seeing battle as us against them. Protect those you love, kill everyone else, but they didn't deserve death. None of them did. He watches as his friends in the Wall Guard and the Parshmen that he befriended kill each other. He falls to his knees, unable to bear the thought of killing former friends, but then he snaps back to his duty, remembering that he must protect Elhokar and his son. A Queensguard stabs the king's arm with a halberd before being cut down, and Elhokar, holding his son in one arm and the idealized sketch that Shallan drew of him in the other, begins speaking the words. Life before death. Strength before weakness. He begins to glow softly, and Kaladin urges him on. Journey before... Suddenly, Moash drives a spear through Elhokar before the king finishes the first ideal. He shoves aside the weeping child, places his boot against Elhokar's throat, and stabs him in the eyes as well. Moash then turns to Kaladin and quietly taps his wrists together, making a Bridge 4 salute. The Queen, now transformed with black smoke, red eyes, and crystalline formations that pierce her skin like carapace, descends the stairs, her chest glowing with a bright gemstone. Twin Radiants flood the chamber with Stormlight as Drahi and Scar clear a path to protect Cal when he can't protect himself, before Adolin pulls a distraught Kaladin away from the dead king. Now later, upon reaching the Oathgate and looking out over Kholinar, Adolin sees a vast horde of Parshmen and Fused preparing for a final assault, and he realizes that the city is lost. He urges everyone to abandon the city and evacuate to Urithiru, and entering the control room, he finds Shallan hesitating. She reveals that Shah Anat, the Unmade, warned that the Oathgate is a trap. However, seeing no other option, they activate the Oathgate, while Shah Anat vows that she will try not to kill them. Now, meanwhile, Dalinar waits anxiously at Urithiru for any word from Kholinar, and his thoughts are burdened by the traumatic memories of his actions that have just resurfaced. Hours pass in tense silence. Finally, a Spanreed message arrives with the grim news that Kholinar has fallen. Now, when the Oathgate is activated, it shifts its platform into Shadesmar, dumping Adolin into the beads until Azure pulls him out. And Adolin is stunned by the bizarre surroundings, a pitch black sky with strange clouds stretching toward a distant small sun, and a vast ocean made up of tiny beads, and two massive spren hover nearby, one black and one red, ominously watching them. Adolin is further surprised to see the Shadesmar forms of both Pattern and Syl, and oddly, a third spren. Another spren stood beside her, with ashen brown features that seemed to be made of tight cords, the thickness of hair. She wore ragged clothing, and her eyes had been scratched out, like a canvas someone had taken a knife to. Azure grimly states how she hates this place. Clearly, she's been here before, and if you skip the earlier Easter egg, this is a dead giveaway that High Marshal Azure is much more than she seems. And with that, we move on to Interlude 7. Venli recounts a skewed version of the War of Reckoning, and she urges the singers to fight for Odium. Now, she's frustrated at how far behind the singers are, and she suggests that they use human slaves to speed up the work. But Rhine dismisses her idea, arguing they must kill all humans to prevent surge binding among them. Back in her room, Venli frees a curious spren pulsing with the old rhythms rather than Odium's new ones. While moving, the spren resembles a comet and a small glowing spark when still. She tells it to leave, but it pulses with resolve and stays. Interlude 8. Mem carefully launders clothes for her employer, Mraize, scrubbing out a mysterious stain that's mixed with blood. Now afterwards, she checks on her lovely wash girl named Palm, and together they deliver the laundry to Mraize's residence, where Mem admires his strange artifacts and paintings, and suddenly Palm starts slashing one of Mraize's paintings of the heralds with a knife, and Mraize addresses her as Ancient One, saying that his Bapsk has been eager to speak with her. He manages to get her attention by mentioning that he knows the location of Telenalat. Now afterwards, Mraize gives Mem a bonus and praises her for getting the Aether stain out of his suit. Now if you didn't pick up on this detail, Palm is actually the herald Shalash, and once again she's destroying any images of herself. And just a reminder, we also learned back in Words of Radiance that Mraize's Bapsk, or master, is Eatil. And also we do get a Cosmere Easter egg here in regards to Mraize's suit, which was stained with Aether. Now again, skip ahead if you don't want to know the Easter egg. Aether comes from one of Sanderson's early unreleased books called Aether of Night. Now, Aethers are a very ancient variety of invested entities that have spread to various worlds in the Cosmere. For instance, on Lumar, the world in Tress of the Emerald Sea, there's a rare strain of Aethers. And each moon is home to one of 12 Aethers that produce spores that rain down on the planet. Anyways, I won't go into any more details about Aethers, but let me know what you think Mraize is up to. Interlude 9. Venli is flown by the Fused to Kholinar, and upon landing, she asks if her assignment is complete. Rhine tells her that her previous work in the villages was just practice, and her true mission is only beginning. Interlude 10, a commander formerly in Amaram's army named Sheller listens as a Herdasian general outlines his punishment options for a crime that he committed, which included killing and robbing civilians, among other darker things. Now, this is a small detail, but Sheller is actually the commander who gave 3 untrained boys, including Kaladin's brother Tien, as soldiers, which was basically just giving them a death sentence as they were just used as a distraction. Now, the general offers 3 choices of how Sheller can die. The sword, where women he wronged can hack at him, the hammer, where his limbs are broken and he's hung over the cliff near the ocean, or the hog, where he must wrestle a hog while greased. He chooses the hog and he's doused in a foul-smelling oil, then an enormous claw emerges from the ocean, and Sheller realizes that the hog might be more than just a nickname. Interlude 11. Venli has arrived outside Kholinar, but she's barred entry. She's kept outside to deliver her speech or sermon several times a day to dozens of groups of singers, and she wonders if she could become a fused herself, but her spren, named Tamber, urges her to resist Odium. But Venli wishes Eshonai were in her place. She feels that Eshonai would make the right choices, unlike herself. When the Everstorm arrives, Venli experiences a vision of Odium's overwhelming presence, and his burning power sears her as he scolds her restlessness and claims her as his own. Now, she collapses, telling Tamber she isn't strong enough to resist, and that the spren has chosen the wrong sister. Now, the chapter epigraphs for part 3 are records retrieved from the gem archive in Urithiru, with each gemstone being associated with an order of the Knights Radiance and the herald associated with that order. Now, these transcriptions give us a lot of info about each order and the issues that they faced, and there's also mention of the sibling, which is an entity that seems to be connected to Urithiru, as well as honor and cultivation. The Radiants talk about how something is happening to the sibling and how it's now sleeping. Moving on to part 4, which covers chapters 88 to 113. 8 years ago, Dalinar attends a political meeting with Gavilar, still haunted by the atrocities that he committed at the Rift. Unable to endure the sight and sound of fire, Dalinar leaves the meeting to search for alcohol to numb the screaming in his mind. And while wandering, he encounters Adolin, who's proudly dressed in a tailored uniform and excitedly shares his plans to win a shard blade through a duel. Now, Dalinar dismisses him harshly. Dalinar eventually finds himself at the beggar's porch, where he drinks with a beggar, Ahu, who cryptically mentions past desolations and torment. Now, unbeknownst to Dalinar, Ahu is actually Yezrien, the Herald of Kings, sitting beside his own statue. The Herald references several unmade here: the Black Fisher, aka Gonarthis, which is one we don't really know much about yet. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. The Spawning Mother, which is most likely Re-Shephir, and the Faceless, which I assume is a Shirtmar, as they take the form of a giant heart. Or it could be Nergal, who takes the form of red mist and is responsible for the thrill. And then he mentions Moloch, and Moloch we know is the one that triggers the death rattles. Now, it's interesting to note that Yezrien can spot the effects of an encounter with the Unmade on Dalinar. Drunk, Dalinar stumbles upon a conversation between Gavilar, Elokar, and Adolin, discussing his drinking and failed attempts to hide it. And this confrontation with his shame brings back painful memories of Evie, driving him to retreat to his room and collapse into despair. Back to Adolin, who's looking at the alien landscape of Shadesmar, thinking they all might be dead and in damnation. When Kaladin tries to fly, the spren begin consuming his stormlight, drawn by its presence, and he reluctantly lands. Azure explains their location, and Adolin begins summoning his shard blade, but the spren with scratched out eyes screeches in protest, and Pattern informs him this spren is his shard blade, and it's quite dead. The group feels a massive rumble as an Unmade rises from the depths of the bead ocean, an enormous hand reaching out slowly through the glass beads. Deep beneath them, a heartbeat begins sounding, rattling the beads. And obviously, not wanting to deal with that, they decide to flee toward the nearby river, which corresponds to land in the cognitive realm, because many things here are inverted. Now, souls of the living look like flames in Shadesmar, while souls of objects look like beads. And Shallan accidentally bumps into one of the souls of the living that swarmed around the Oathgate control chamber. And as she touches it, she notices that it's the soul of Drehi. And for a brief moment, she feels his emotions and how he's panicking with the fact that they disappeared, and he's not prepared to take Kaladin's role and act like a commander. Now, she begins manipulating the beads of Shadesmar to create objects, though she can't seem to make them move. So she uses two objects, the roof of the Oathgate control building and a big door, and she alternates them in a tedious, exhausting fashion to move the entire party to the solid ground of the river. And Pattern notes that the soul flames are no longer disappearing, meaning that the humans in the physical realm have surrendered and they're no longer dying. The fighting is over. Syl mentions the Oathgate Spren have been corrupted, and Shallan notes that Shah Anat kept her word by not killing them. Now, Adolin, feeling helpless, tries to focus on supporting Kaladin, who's riddled with guilt over his failure to stop the fighting and protect his men and the death of the king. Now, Adolin keeps Kaladin talking to help him cope, recognizing his friend's need for someone to listen. Finally, they decide to camp for the night, and Syl expresses her worry for Kaladin's emotional state. Now, at one point, Adolin notices that Azure's hair is fading and turning gray. Now, this is going to be a brief COSMERE Easter egg here. Skip ahead if you haven't read Warbreaker. Now, just a reminder that Vivenna's royal locks are tied to her emotions, and gray or white hair means that she's either panicking or she's fearful. Up to now, she's had control over her emotions and she's kept them in check, but now her emotions are showing. Also note how her sword doesn't turn into a spren here in Shadesmar, again showing us her blade isn't exactly a shard blade. Now, in this chapter, we also get this artwork depicting a map of an area of Shadesmar, and once again, it's annotated by the world hopper Naz. He leaves a lot of snarky comments here, and he mentions how he rode a Mandra from here to Celebrant, and apparently him and Chris had some sort of bet. He also mentions stealing this map from someone named Smolderbrand. I'm not sure who that is, but maybe we'll see this character eventually. In chapter 90, we switch to Szeth. Szeth trains at the Skybreaker Fortress near the Pure Lake, accompanied by Nightblood, who persistently urges him to wield it more often. However, Szeth remains cautious, only drawing the sword in dire emergencies and with sufficient stormlight, lest the sword feeds upon his soul. Now, we get a quick recap of some of the events in Edge Dancer, at least from Szeth's perspective. After the Everstorm arrived, Nail, or Nin as he calls him, finally realized he was wrong about trying to prevent the desolations by hunting Surgebinders, and he left Szeth in Tashik for weeks before returning and bringing him to the Skybreakers Fortress before flying off again. Now, we also learn the Skybreakers are basically a secret society. They never disbanded, never turned their backs on their spren, and instead they continued in secret. Determined to finish the Skybreaker training and return to Shinovar to cleanse the land, Szeth listens as Ki informs him and 5 other initiates that they're deemed worthy to speak the first ideal of the immortal words. And while the others proclaim the ideal boldly, Szeth whispers it to the voices of the dead he seeks to avenge. Now, Ki explains the path ahead involving tests and bonding with a high spren, and Szeth is content knowing that only Nin can ultimately judge him. Now, speaking of Nin, I do want to note how it's mentioned that Nail couldn't heal Szeth's madness, and that Szeth was hearing trembles from the spiritual realm. And it's also mentioned how Szeth's spirit hasn't properly reattached to his body, causing him to leave a glowing after image when he moves, which is very strange. Now, we do get a COSMERE Easter egg here, and I'm going to be talking about some pretty big things in Warbreaker, so feel free to skip ahead if you haven't read Warbreaker yet. Nightblood mentions how Vasher says there's magic fish here. And this is the first time Vasher's name actually gets dropped in the Stormlight archive. The sword also mentions how it only destroys things that are evil. And to give you a brief recap on what Nightblood is, Nightblood was an attempt by Vasher and his wife Shashara, two of the 5 scholars on Nalthis, to create a shard blade like the ones they'd seen on Roshar when they world hopped some 300 or so years ago. Since they were using the wrong magic system, it didn't quite work right, and instead of a cognitive entity who could take a physical form, they created a physical object with some cognition. They awakened it at the cost of 1,000 breaths. Now every awakening requires a command, so they told it to destroy evil. However, swords don't exactly have an inherent moral compass, so basically to Nightblood, evil is anyone who tries to steal him and use him to do bad things, or really anyone who tries to hurt the one wielding him. Now, if Nightblood is removed from his aluminum scabbard even a little bit, he starts feeding on investiture. And on Nalthis, that means he would take the breath from anyone he touches. And here on Roshar, he can absorb all the stormlight in a vicinity and then begin to devour the one holding or touching it. And Nightblood doesn't know when to stop, so it's up to someone else to sheath him again. That's the COSMERE Easter egg. Now later, Szeth arrives at a small town on the north shore of the Pure Lake along with the rest of the Skybreaker trainees and squires, and they're charged with finding and executing a group of escaped prisoners. While the other squires set off immediately, Szeth lingers to ask questions about the situation, which frustrates Nightblood. Now I should note that Szeth mentions that Nightblood reminds him of a single voice that he heard in his head when he was younger, not the multiple whispers that he knows now. I don't know about you, but to me this sounds like Szeth had the beginnings of a Spren bond years ago. Maybe that's why he knew the Radiants were returning, and that's why he was declared truthless. Now, Szeth eventually tracks the criminal and interrogates the desperate, malnourished man who admits to killing a guard to escape. Szeth then coldly allows the man to drown. Afterward, he investigates the prison, discovering squalid conditions and a dead guard, and returning to the town, he accuses the corrupt prison warden of embezzling funds meant for the prison. Szeth then draws Nightblood and kills the prison guard. Liquid darkness flowed from the blade, then melted to smoke as it fell. Szeth screamed at the pain in his arm even as he slammed the weapon through the chest of the blubbering nobleman. Flesh and blood puffed instantly into black smoke. Ordinary shard blades burned only the eyes, but this sword somehow consumed the entire body. It seemed to sear away even the man's soul. Now Ki, the Master Skybreaker, declares Szeth her squire. He then speaks the second ideal. I swear to seek justice, to let it guide me until I find a more perfect ideal. Szeth regains the ability to draw in stormlight, taking joy in soaring through the skies once again. Now, I should also note that Nightblood mentions Vivenna, and also apparently Nightblood has very little sense of time, with 1 hour or 10,000 hours being indistinguishable to him. Adolin wakes up in Shadesmar. He tries chatting with Maya, who doesn't respond, so then he begins a calming kata exercise. Now, Azure knows the same exercise as she reveals that Xyle was also her sword master, and Kaladin joins along with them as well. Syl explains how there are 3 realms, the highest being the spiritual, where the gods live, and there all things, times, and spaces are made into one. She then explains how they're in the cognitive realm, Shadesmar, where Spren live. And then of course there is the physical realm. Azure then explains that she knows of another way to transfer between realms, and she says that she's from a far land and came to Roshar by crossing into this place, saying that she came here chasing a criminal, and she thought maybe the wall guard would have information on the man that she's hunting. She says that she used Cultivation's perpendicularity, which is located at the Horneater Peaks, and she says there's another perpendicularity which is unpredictable and dangerous, dangerous and appears randomly in different places. And since they can't use the Oathgate anymore because of the corrupted Spren, they decide a perpendicularity is where they must go to return to the physical realm. They're interrupted by a loud screeching sound, and Kaladin leads the group as dangerous Spren pursue them. Pattern advises them to suppress their emotions as anger Spren are drawn to them. Though Kaladin insists he isn't angry, he still holds on to his frustration to counteract the depression of failing Kholinar. But eventually he distracts himself and the Spren retreat. Over several days of travel, Kaladin talks to Syl about her past, and she recalls living in a grand city ruled by honor Spren, and she mentions bonding with another man, an elderly man who was killed before the Recreants, leaving her broken. Her father forbade her from leaving the city again, but she defied him when she heard Kaladin's call. And then suddenly Syl notices a light in the distance, a lighthouse. And we got another flashback. 7 years ago, Dalinar tears apart his room, searching for wine after returning from a hunting trip where he encountered the Parshendi. Though the hunt briefly revived his old self, he despises himself for the man he's become. The ever-present screaming torments him, and both Adolin and Renarin arrive to investigate the commotion, but Dalinar angrily throws them out. And later, Renarin returns with a small bottle of wine and embraces Dalinar, who collapses in tears, praying to the Almighty for release from his pain. Now, as painful of a chapter that was, we then get this brilliant illustration giving us a chart of the various wines on Roshar, and it's annotated by our snarky world hopper Naz, who's apparently quite the drinker. He mentions how a Horneater lager is responsible for his embarrassing tattoo, and how he's had milk more intoxicating than a Rosharan pink. Apparently Sapphire wine tastes like whiskey, and Auburn wine is the one made from fermented fruit and tastes most like regular grape wine. If you haven't noticed, wine is the name given to basically all alcohol on Roshar, just like how they call all Burge chickens. And Sanderson has actually confirmed, saying they don't actually have grapes on Roshar, but they did on Ashin, which is why all the alcohol just became wine on Roshar, but identified by their different colors. Now switching to Navani, who leads the first coalition meeting of all the monarchs in order to discuss the Voidbringers. And in Alethi tradition, each person brings their own chair. And when Bridge 4 arrives, they all have simple chairs, besides one Herdasian man who brings the most grand chair with embroidered blue cloth and silver. All hail King Lopen. Anyways, discussions vary. Navani refocuses the group by proposing roles for each kingdom, distributing responsibilities according to their strengths. And then back to Kaladin, in a flashback, he remembers one of his various attempts to escape slavery, a disastrous one in which he was leading a whole group and every last one of them was killed, all but him. In the present, Kal scouts ahead to the lighthouse, and inside, he encounters what he thinks is a Shin man named Reno, and this man offers to tell his fortune with a glowing crystal orb. Now at this moment, a high storm is passing, which in Shadesmar appears as the sky rippling with light and clouds shimmering, giving a strange ethereal luminescence. And as it passes, it gives Kaladin brief access to the spiritual realm, and as he touches the orb, he's swept into a vision of Dalinar surrounded by 9 ominous figures and a city by the ocean, which he later identifies as Thaylen City. How impossible, unless you're invested. What heightening are you? He squinted at Kaladin. No, something else. Merciful Dami, a surge binder. It has begun again? Now, who really is this man, Reno? It's time for some COSMERE Easter eggs. This is an Elantris Easter egg. It doesn't have any plot spoilers for that book, but if you do want to skip ahead, go ahead. The fact that Reno said Merciful Dami is a big giveaway that this man is Elantrian. He comes from planet Sel. Now, Brandon has confirmed that Reno is the old man who keeps saying, so beautiful, the dude that was dissolved in the blue pool in Elantris. Yeah, that guy is a world hopper, apparently, and when trying to discover what form of investiture Kaladin is using, he mentions heightening, and if you don't know, that is a Nalthis thing. It's related to the magic system in Warbreaker. Now there's also a few paintings on the wall in this room, which are small Easter eggs as well. One is a cityscape at dusk before an ominous wall that has light glowing beyond it. Now this really does sound like it could be a depiction of the city in The Girl Who Stood Up, the story told by both Shallan and Wit. However, it's likely actually a painting of the city of Elantris. Now the next painting depicts people kneeling around a bright white mirror. Now this does bear a similarity to the murals found within Elantris of devotion's perpendicularity, so likely that's what the white mirror represents. Okay, now meanwhile, Shallan struggles with Veil's influence seeping into her psyche and ruining her sketches. A corrupted glory spren approaches and speaks with Shah Anat's voice, warning Shallan that Odium's forces are hunting them. Shah Anat reveals that she misled Odium about their location, but fears her deception may be discovered. Adolin and Shallan then bargain with Reno for some supplies, and they enjoy some canned food, learning that the Lighthouse basically functions as a waypoint in which passing ships can restock their supplies, as well as to signal that there's land nearby. Now, Kaladin shares his vision of Thaylen City with the group, proposing they head to the Oathgate there to return to the physical realm. And then a ship arrives to take them to Celebrant, the next step in their journey through Shadesmar. The next chapter, chapter 96, brings us back to Szeth and his fellow squires, who are participating in a training exercise where they have to navigate poles while avoiding being hit and striking opponents with colored pouches. So kind of like paintball. Szeth initially excels at this, but then he becomes distracted by the realization that he's actually enjoying himself, a feeling he believes he doesn't deserve. He blocks attacks with a pole and uses another squire as a shield, but eventually runs out of stormlight and falls into the water. Now Szeth thinks he has failed, but the water washes away his uniform, leaving no marks to deduct points. And the High Spren overseeing the exercise are impressed by his ingenuity in exploiting the loophole. As Szeth prepares to swear the third ideal, Nail shows up, telling all of them it's time they know the two greatest secrets that he knows. Now I know some people are sensitive to COSMERE spoilers, but I do want to point out another Easter egg. Skip ahead maybe just like 5 or 10 seconds if you don't want to know. This is related to Warbreaker. Okay, now Nightblood mentions Vasher, saying that he teaches swords to people now. And of course, this is a major hint for those who still haven't picked up on Vasher's identity on Roshar. We then switch back to Shadesmar. The group travels on a ship crewed by Reachers, captained by a spren named Eco, and using a unique condenser fabrial, Eco creates water for the humans aboard. Now Syl is disguised by light weaving to avoid being recognized as an honor spren, and Kaladin, browsing Shallan's sketchbook, notices oddly childish drawings among her usual work. Now they end up discussing the Mandra spren that are pulling the ship, and they speculate about how these spren in the physical realm are likely what helps sky eels fly, and anything that should be heavier than it actually is, like a chasm fiend. And here we get to see some of Shallan's sketches of these mandras, accompanied by some of her scholarly notes, and the shape of the head is exactly the same as the Lux spren that she's seen around the sky eels, chasm fiends, and other great shells. So likely the reason a chasm fiend doesn't collapse under its own weight is because these spren help lift it up. Now in chapter 100, Dalinar surveys the war-torn city of Vedinar, still shaken by his newly awakened memories. Taravangian joins him and has a somewhat disturbing discussion on morality. He then explains how fabrials are created by enslaving spren, and this unsettles Dalinar even further. Overwhelmed, Dalinar seeks solace among the soldiers in the storm shelters, and here a veteran recounts the bloodlust of the Civil War, a haze that compelled them to fight unnecessarily, making it so they couldn't stop no matter how tired they were. And hearing this triggers the thrill within Dalinar, which he realizes has not been conquered, but merely left him to plague Gavinor. Desperate to escape the Thrill's influence and his tormenting memories, he heads to the Oathgate, only to face excommunication from the curates from the Holy Enclave, who denounce him as a heretic for his beliefs about the Almighty. Now, he rushes to activate the Oathgate, but he lacks a shard blade, and ignoring the Stormfather's protests, he uses his bondsmith abilities to form a glowing key, painfully forcing the mechanism to activate and returning to Urithiru. And then in his quarters, Evi's voice haunts him, urging him to accept his true nature. Dalinar retrieves the Way of Kings, the book that once saved him, but its words provide no comfort. And in despair, he ransacks Adolin's room and finds a bottle of wine, raising it to his lips. Meanwhile, Adolin reflects on the burdens of leadership and his potential role as king now that Elhokar is dead, and Dalinar refuses the role. He discusses royal duties with Azure, who shares that of all the things she's walked away from, the one she doesn't regret is allowing someone else to rule, saying that sometimes the best thing to do is to let someone else more capable carry your duty. Now, Eiko takes Adolin to the brig to retrieve his Deadeye. Eiko locked up Maya because Deadeyes don't watch where they're going and they can walk off the deck. The ship docks in Celebrant and Eiko warns them of the city's dangers. The team then splits up. Kaladin, Adolin, and Syl go to gather supplies, and Shallan, Pattern, and Azure to secure their next passage. At the market, Kaladin sees a strange painting of a kneeling figure with 9 shadows, which the merchant explains is from the Court of Gods, and it's meant for divine eyes only. Now, Kaladin senses its connection to the Unmade. Now, I am going to cover a light COSMERE Easter egg here. The Court of Gods is on Nalthis, the world of Warbreaker, and it's mentioned that apparently each person who sees one of these paintings, Nenefra's masterworks, sees something different. But it's completely possible that this is all made up by the Spren merchant so that he can make it worth more. Maybe the painting isn't even from Offworld, it might just be from Roshar. Kaladin also takes a note of a guarded and locked glass box with a long, thin, silvery chain inside that's selling for 1,000 bromes. Now, we don't know what this is yet, and when asked about it, Sanderson said it is a super big Raffo. So this is something very important, but it's going to be revealed later. Possibly it's a silver chain from Threnody, or it's an aluminum chain, but I don't know. I think there is more to this item that will hopefully be revealed in Book 5. Meanwhile, Shallan, Azure, and Pattern learn that no ships are willing to sail to Cultivation's perpendicularity due to the Voidspren-controlled warships in the area. Azure spots a fused interrogating Eiko, forcing them to hide in an alley. Now, Kaladin realizes that Syl is avoiding attention because she's escaped the Honor Spren capital, where there's now a bounty for her return. Eiko's ship is burned, and desperate for escape, Syl reveals herself in order to gain passage on an Honor Spren ship bound for lasting integrity. Dalinar awakens in a vision of Nohadon, who's much older than in previous visions, and is writing a supposed shopping list, not the Way of Kings. Now, Nohadon invites Dalinar to the market, where an enormous shadow and heavy footfalls signal the presence of a thunderclast. Nohadon seems unfazed, but oddly mentions, "This is quite the nightmare you've created," and then continues to tell stories and philosophize. Dalinar laments his frustrations with uniting the coalition, admitting his hypocrisy, and Nohadon reassures him, saying, "Sometimes a hypocrite is nothing more than a man who is in the process of changing. You've said the oaths, but do you understand the journey? Do you understand what it requires? You've forgotten one essential part, one thing that without which there can be no journey. What is the most important step a man can take?" Dalinar wakes up in Urithiru in bed, a mostly empty bottle of wine beside him, and there was no storm, that wasn't a vision. It was some kind of dream, and confused, he suddenly recalls the night of Gavilar's funeral with sudden clarity. But first, we move over to Navani, who's trying her very best to manage Urithiru in Dalinar's absence, trying to address the many different issues that arise with thousands of people living in a semi-functional tower city. In a meeting with Jasnah and Renarin in the library, Navani reviews progress on the gemstone record translations and fabrial research, and Renarin works to uncover patterns in the tower's design. Jasnah seems suspicious of Renarin's powers, and she's collecting information about his abilities and his spren. Now in this chapter, we get some interior art depicting a fabrial vambrace that's briefly mentioned. Now if you want to know what the women's script translates to, it says, touch the gems in the correct combination to release a shock from the front nodes that will incapacitate an attacker. It then notes the top view, side view, storm piece, and timepiece. Okay, back to Dalinar. 6 years ago, Dalinar attends Gavilar's funeral in Kholinar. As the ceremony unfolds and Gavilar's body is soulcast into a stone statue, Elhokar vows vengeance against the Parshendi, and Sadeas is the first to pledge support. Distraught, Dalinar avoids drinking and instead finds Jasnah reading The Way of Kings, and they spend hours bonding over the text. The book gives him some hope, and Dalinar decides to seek the Nightwatcher and her old magic. Then switching back to Szeth, who's traveled with Nin and the Skybreakers for several days, and he arrives in Marat. Nin admits his failure to prevent the desolation and reveals that he selectively targets Surgebinders to preserve balance. Szeth questions Nin's bias, calling him out for brutally enforcing specific laws to achieve his own ends. But Nin, or Nail, defends his adherence to the law. He also reveals himself as a Skybreaker of the 5th ideal, the one where the Skybreaker becomes the law. He also says that he's the only herald to join his own order. He tells Szeth he must learn what truly happened on the day of Aharietium, the last desolation, the day the heralds sacrificed one of their own to end the cycle of pain and death. Now, Dalinar emerges from seclusion, apologizing to the coalition leaders for his absence, and in a strategy meeting, he realizes Odium's forces likely aim to control the Oathgate in Thaylen City, already weakened by the Everstorm. Plans are made to reinforce the city with Alethi troops and naval support from Kharbranth and Azure, and after the meeting, Dalinar seeks Kadash, apologizing for Rathalas and offering to turn the Ardentia over to Taravangian. But Kadash refuses, vowing to guide the Alethi through their struggles. Dalinar then speaks with the Stormfather, who reveals that there's one that he's been watching, saying that he can see her when he doesn't see the others, and Dalinar plans to bring this person into his next vision. And then we briefly switch over to Taravangian, who learns from Adrotagia that Moloch has settled in the Horneater Peaks, and they might again soon have access to the death rattles. And then Malata, spying for him, reports that Dalinar has secret visions, and that her spren, Spark, seeks revenge against the other Radiants. Now back in Shadesmar, aboard the Honor Spren ship, Shallan starts collecting some beads in case they need them to make a quick getaway. Adolin is beginning to worry about how she's acting differently and how she keeps referring to herself in third person, and they have a discussion in which she explains to him about her personality issues. And then Adolin opens up and admits that he killed Sadeas, and she surprises him by simply saying, "Good for you." Now, meanwhile, Azure makes a deal with the First Mate Honor Spren to secure passage for herself and only herself in her quest to hunt down Nightblood after they reach lasting integrity. And as leverage, she gives the Honor Spren her shard blade and advises her not to pull her out the full way, as she doesn't know you. And the Honor Spren is just amazed to see a shard blade that requires no spren. Kaladin, however, is hell-bent on getting to Thaylen City instead, and as soon as possible. He attempts to convince the captain of the ship to take them there, And in the process, he starts drawing near to speaking the fourth ideal. Windspren begin to draw around him, astonishing the crew, and he appeals to the captain to release Syl, claiming his mission to protect Dalinar is vital. As Kaladin's glowing Windspren swirl, fused are spotted approaching the ship. Now this time we get another of Shallan's sketches, and this is detailing the Spren in Shadesmar. And in the top left, we see Vale's attempt at drawing the captain, Eco. Also, there's a little ghost blood symbol underneath. And then we move to Dalinar, who's entering a high storm vision, and he brings with him the person that the Stormfather's been watching, Venli. And here in Nohadon's palace, he proposes terms for peace, offering a split kingdom with Parshendi high princes. And Venli is very skeptical, but she's intrigued, and she considers his words until the vision begins crumbling apart as Odium arrives. Odium smashes the sky above them like it was an enormous dome ceiling, and Venli is awestruck by Dalinar's radiant power, able to hold the vision together and keep a small area around them stable. As Odium punches another hole in the shell of a sky, she sees Tamber trying vainly to reach her, and as she risks Odium's pull to rescue the little Spren, she begins to fall, and Dalinar puts himself at risk to reach her and dismiss her from the vision. He then confronts Odium, who assures him that peace will come, but only after Dalinar destroys the world. The vision ends with the Stormfather weeping, overwhelmed by Odium's might. With the fused closing in, Shallan soul casts an underwater air bubble beneath the bead sea. Kaladin leads Syl out from the brig, but Azure remains behind, revealing her search is for Xyle, claiming that he's an old friend. The group jumps into the beads, hiding from the fused, while Shallan shapes a protective room. And once the fused pass, the group struggles to shore, where Syl reports their pursuers have moved on. Now, a high storm, the same one that Dalinar used for his vision, restores Syl's strength, and drawing Stormlight, Kaladin lashes the group together, and they take flight toward the Thaylen city Oathgate. Now, I do want to pause here and discuss a little bit about Azure. So this is another COSMERE Easter egg related to Warbreaker. If you want to skip ahead, do so now. Okay, so Azure, or Vivenna, ordered the sailors to cut up bales of cloth and say they'll soon understand why. So it kind of seems like she's planning on awakening a whole boatload of objects to fight off the fused, likely using a lot of investiture. Now, I actually think that Vivenna and Vashur have a big advantage on Roshar, where high storms regularly provide massive amounts of investiture that they can store up internally, and she likely even stores some of it in her Azure cape, in order to avoid getting to godlike levels. In fact, she's probably very powerful here and isn't even that worried about the fused. It really makes you wonder what heightening she is. And now I really wish we got to see that battle on the boat against the fused. Okay, COSMERE spoiler over. Chapter 111. Dalinar arrives in Thaylen City and briefly talks with Amaram. The Stormfather seems to have recovered, but when Dalinar has questions about the third sibling, the Stormfather refuses and says, "You have hurt them enough." During a council meeting, Renarin grows uneasy and excuses himself, prompting Dalinar to sense something amiss. News arrives that a new Everstorm is on the way, and it's early and far stronger and faster than usual. Meanwhile, Yasna and Navani have finally received a translation of the Dawn Chant, specifically one of the oldest records, said to be scribed by the heralds themselves. And it's not what they expected. It reveals the shocking truth that humans were the original Voidbringers. The first desolation was the invasion of humankind onto Roshar. We came here and we seized this land from the Parshmen after we accidentally used surge binding to destroy our previous world. That is the truth that destroyed the Radiance. Beware the otherworlders, the traitors, those with tongues of sweetness, but with minds that lust for blood. Do not take them in. Do not give them succor. Well were they named Voidbringers, for they bring the void, the empty pit that sucks in emotion, a new god, their god. The revelation sparks distrust as Fen, Nora, and Taravangian voice concerns about Radiant's power and Dalinar's secrets. Navani believes someone deliberately released all this information at once to destroy their reputation. Now the meeting descends into chaos as the coalition begins to crumble. Kaladin reflects on a farewell moment with a girl he was dating in Amaram's army named Terra, where she encouraged him to focus on the living rather than dwelling on the dead. Her words motivate him as the group climbs a hill and spot Thaylen City. They see the Oathgate in the distance with two towering spren, one sparkling a multitude of colors and the other shimmering an oily black. While they don't appear to be corrupted, they're surrounded by an army of void spren. Later, the Stormfather reveals to Dalinar that the Knights Radiant broke their oaths not just because of the truth about humans being the Voidbringers, but to prevent Surge Binding from destroying Roshar as it did their homeworld, Ashin. In the past, Honor was able to guard against this, but in the days leading to the Recreants, Honor was dying. When the generation of Knights learned the truth, Honor did not support them. He raved, speaking of the Dawn Shards, ancient weapons used to destroy the Tranquillian halls. Honor promised that Surgebinders would do the same to Roshar. Odium claimed the same thing. He can see the future, though only cloudly. Now, we also learn that Shinovar was a place they were given when they arrived, a place where the plants and animals the humans brought could grow. Dalinar meets with each monarch, sensing the coalition unraveling. Taravangian had arranged this reveal in order to destroy Dalinar, but he claims he assumed everyone had the same information and it would be best to air it. He plays the role of a kindly old man, and Dalinar falls for it. Now, even Bridge 4, usually so hopeful, seems to be disturbed by the truth of the ancient Radiance. Interlude 12. Venli delivers a speech to Thaylen Parshman, focusing on emotions and passion as instructed, and a deranged fused grabs her and flies her to a harbor ship where hundreds of vessels are waiting to sail towards Thaylen City. Rhine informs her that she will join the assault and reassures her that the fused are there to restore the singer's home. The Everstorm approaches to push them there faster. Interlude 13. This brings us back to Rissyn. After being paralyzed from the waist down after her last interlude in Words of Radiance, Rissyn is now working as one of Queen Fen's stewards at the Thaylen Gemstone Reserve. Vistim, her old Bapsk, arrives to do an audit of the vault, and he brings a ruby for Rissyn's Larkin named Chiri Chiri. And Chiri Chiri feeds on this by absorbing the Stormlight. Now, he also brings another present. He offers Rissyn command of her own ship, the Wandersail. She says Vistim is a romantic to name it that, and he says that you can believe in a story without believing that it happened. And just a reminder that this is the story Wandersail that Hoyd tells Kaladin in chapter 57 of The Way of Kings. Now, during the audit, they enter Vault 13, the Queen's own vault, containing the massive ruby called the King's Drop, a gem that somehow remained glowing for over 200 years. Now suddenly, an unfamiliar guard attacks, revealing himself as a fused that can light weave. He kills guards, locks Vistim in the vault, and tries to escape with the ruby, but Rissyn ties the King's Drop to her leg and pulls herself down the corridor. Chiri Chiri feeds from the ruby, and then trying to protect her, begins draining the void light from the fused attacker. Using a fallen crossbow, she shoots the fused in the chin, and void light gone, he falls to the ground, defeated. And Interlude 14. Teft and the rest of Bridge 4 return to the barracks, and he's urged by his spren to speak the words, but he resists. Arriving at the barracks, they find dead and wounded bridgemen, and learn that the honor blade they were guarding has been stolen. Besig reveals that the attacker wore a Bridge 4 coat with lieutenant's knots. Teft realizes in horror that the coat was his, sold to fuel his fire moss addiction. And now we move on to part 5, the final part, consisting of chapters 114 to 122. Flashback 5.5 years ago, Dalinar travels in a caravan with Felt and tells the man to pay the caravan master more to buy his silence. Now, along the way, Felt gives some advice for visiting the Nightwatcher, telling him to go in alone after sunset and warning him that the curse could be bad. Apparently, Felt tried visiting the Nightwatcher himself, but she never appeared as she doesn't seem to like foreigners, especially someone as foreign as himself. Now, Dalinar arrives at the valley, and after sunset, he begins his trek through the dense, eerie forest. He hears voices, people pleading for their lives and weeping, and he summons his Shardblade to cut through the undergrowth. Suddenly, he sees himself smiling and killing Parshmen in the unclaimed hills, then strangling Elokar and taking the throne for himself, followed by conquering other kingdoms and building an empire over half the continent. Then he sees 1,000 villages being burned like the Rift for resisting him. Dalinar realizes that this could be his future. Just then, the Nightwatcher appears, and for his boon, Dalinar asks for forgiveness, but the creature struggles to understand and instead offers material boons and power. She even offers him a blade that bleeds darkness and cannot be defeated. Nightblood. Wow, just imagine the Blackthorn with Nightblood. Now, her mother, revealed to be Cultivation, intervenes as the Nightwatcher doesn't understand. Cultivation offers to prune Dalinar's memories of Evie to allow him to move past the guilt and sorrow and grow. However, she does warn him that these memories will grow back in time. The next day, he realizes he's unable to remember anything about his wife, and he orders his men to prepare for travel to the Shattered Plains and asks for a copy of the Way of Kings. Now, there is a minor COSMERE Easter egg I want to mention in regards to Mistborn. If you don't want to know, skip ahead like 30 seconds, or I'll have a timestamp on the screen. Now, there is some strange details about Felt. Felt doesn't have the same epicanthic folds to his eyes as most Eastern Rosharans do. His eyes are closer to the round shape of the Shin people. Now, when Felt mentions being more foreign than Dalinar, well, that's because Felt isn't even from Roshar. It seems like Cultivation doesn't like talking to world hoppers, which is another reason she doesn't like talking to Hoid as well. Felt comes from Scadrial. He was one of the main spies for House Venture, having worked for Straff Venture before the latter fled Luthadel, and he subsequently worked for his son, Elend Venture. During the siege of Luthadel, Felt was tasked with figuring out how the city was being infiltrated by someone who was poisoning food, and later Elend utilizes Felt's skills to search for a Khandra spy. Now, what exactly this man is doing on Roshar, we don't really know. He seems to be traveling with his wife named Mali, who acts as sort of a scribe on his missions, and he somehow became one of the Blackthorn's most trusted associates. We also briefly learned in Words of Radiance during the Battle of Narok that Felt was reporting to Lyn, and they both scouted the plateau together. Is he tied to one of the various groups or secret societies of the COSMERE, or maybe he's just an adventurer? I'm not sure, but I like Felt. He's a cool guy. Anyway, that ends the Easter egg. And now begins the massive point of view switching Sanderlanche. I'm gonna try to cover this as best as I can. Back to the present, Dalinar watches the Everstorm settle over Thaylen City as enemy ships sail in. He contemplates the return of his memories and the vital step that he must take. Grabbing a copy of the Way of Kings, he heads into the city. Meanwhile, Shallan, Kaladin, and Adolin reach the Oathgate platform in Shadesmar, surrounded by Fused. The Fused begin to cross over to the physical realm, and they begin making a plan to access the Oathgate. Jasnah locates Renarin in a temple, kneeling with Gliss, his red spren. Now, Jasnah has sketches of what a Truthwatcher spren should look like, and Renarin's spren doesn't match up. His spren is corrupted. Believing him to be a traitor, she summons her Shardblade as she prepares to confront him. Gliss sees her and flees, and she overhears Renarin whispering about seeing something bad happen to Dalinar. Venli stands with the fused and the singers, questioning her place in the battle, as Odium himself arrives to personally oversee it, manifesting as a parchment with marbled gold and white skin. Thunderclasts rise from the ground, and Odium summons forth Nergal, the Unmade, which controls the Thrill, to fight for his side. The Thrill takes control of Amaram's army, and Odium orders them to kill the Blackthorn, to set their passions free, to give him their pain, and seize the city in his name. Meanwhile, Teft stumbles onto a balcony and witnesses singers flooding into Urithiru. He's horrified to realize the tower is also under attack. Now in this chapter, we get some stunning art of the weird Shadesmar sentinels of the Thaylen Oathgate. And speaking of which, Kaladin approaches the Oathgate. He draws Stormlight and lashes himself upward, luring 4 fused into pursuit. He then disarms one of them and takes its spear before flying off. Shallan uses elaborate illusions to distract the remaining 2 fused, with Adolin and the others joining in to help, allowing her to approach the 2 Spren. She pleads for access but is denied. They were ordered by Honor, who they call the Parent, to not allow travel to and from Shadesmar. She asks why they let the army through earlier, and the Sentinels say,
"The souls of the dead, they did not need our portal. They were called by the enemy, pulled along ancient paths to waiting hosts."
Adolin and Pattern maintain their disguise among Shallan's illusions, but a fused cuts its hand and sprays its blood to reveal the real targets. Adolin tries to fight knife versus spear, but the fused stabs him through the stomach. Before the fused can finish him off, Adolin's Deadeye Spren savagely intervenes and attacks, allowing Adolin time to crawl towards Shallan, bleeding heavily. Kaladin, also in trouble, runs out of Stormlight and crashes into the Bead Sea. Struggling, he sinks under, but Syl manages to pull him to shore. Shallan manifests a wall from the physical realm, causing the fuse to crash into it. She runs to Adolin and they jump into the Bead Ocean together. And on the shore, Kaladin tries to treat Adolin's wounds, but he believes it's too late. Adolin prepares to fight a last stand to give the others a chance to get away. And Syl encourages Kaladin to say the words and speak the 4th ideal. Meanwhile, Dalinar, clutching the Way of Kings, feels the familiarity of the Thrill, but ignores it. He's hit by a falling boulder from the Thunderclast, but he heals his injury with Stormlight, and the Thunderclast attacks the Gemstone Reserve as the feuds fight Rissyn and her guards before stealing the King's Drop Ruby. Dalinar is baffled why they want the gemstone, and then is further shocked when he sees Amaram's men have been corrupted. Venli watches the chaos and sees the fused carrying the large ruby. She notices a black figure of swirling smoke standing beside Odium. Odium tells her he intends to not only win the city, but to claim a conduit for his freedom. Szeth and Nin hover over the battle watching, and Nin believes Amaram's troops have seen the truth, that the Parshmen are the rightful owners of Roshar, which makes Szeth uncomfortable. Now, Nightblood, on the other hand, urges Szeth to fight the Parshendi. Szeth replies that he has no choice, and Nightblood brings up the time he spent following his Oathstone. Szeth tries to say he had no choice in what he did, but then he realizes that his Oathstone was just a rock all along, and that he actually did have a choice. And then we also see Yanagon on his ship. He struggles with his role as Emperor as he wants to fight, but his advisors hold check on his power. A guard comes in and reports that Lift has escaped. And speaking of which, Lift appears to Dalinar and asks him what the plan is. He gives her the mission of stealing the ruby from the fused who took it, warning her that he saw fused with similar abilities to hers. He mentions how his army is Odium's now, and Lift asks if Dalinar forgot to feed them. She then uses her Edge Dancer abilities to slide through the battlefield, pursuing the fused, but the fused is much better at this surge than she is. At one point, Lift mentions how the Nightwatcher had promised her she wouldn't get any older, but the Nightwatcher had lied. Now up above, Nin makes the decision that the Skybreakers will serve the Dawnsingers as Roshar's rightful rulers, but Szeth still doesn't trust Nin's judgment. He asks if he can follow a person instead of the law when he swears the third ideal. Nin cautions that the men he followed before had caused him pain, but Szeth looks at Dalinar and wonders if he was simply forced to follow the wrong men. Now Odium confronts Dalinar, placing a hand on his shoulder. Dalinar feels Odium's overwhelming power and recalls Honor's advice. He demands a contest of champions for the fate of Roshar. Odium questions his certainty, and Dalinar confirms it, offering Odium freedom if he wins. Odium says he's already chosen his champion, and he's been preparing him for a long time. Lift continues her pursuit, but is crushed under a thunder-classed fist. She heals herself and prepares to fight again, but then a spear of light slices the creature in two. Wielding Nightblood, Szeth slays the Thunderclast, and he asks what Dalinar had tasked her with, and joins her on her mission. Now Navani, refusing to let him be a martyr, rushes to Dalinar, but she's ambushed by red-eyed soldiers who capture her and Queen Fen, intending to deliver them to Amaram as a reward. Now we then briefly switch to the Herald Ash, as she searches the Alethi camp, defacing another image of herself, and she marvels that Odium can bond his spren to humans, and has created his own storm. She then finds Taln in a tent, and begs the Herald to recognize her. Then over to Renarin, who stands before the stained glass in the temple, seeing visions of potential futures. He sees Jasnah preparing to strike him down, and horrifyingly, a future where Dalinar becomes Odium's champion. As he waits for his own death, he pleads for his father to not give in to Odium. And back to Dalinar, the thrill suddenly rushes into him, threatening to consume him. Odium has chosen his champion. His mind is flooded with vivid memories of the atrocities that he's committed, offering to take his guilt and pain away if he submits. Now over in Shadesmar, Kaladin tries to say the fourth ideal. Windspren begin to form around him, and he thinks of his brother Tien, but he can't say the fourth ideal. Tears start streaming down his face as he realizes he isn't strong enough to save Adolin. Meanwhile, Teft also feels helpless. He's paralyzed by his guilt and shame, and he listens as his comrades in Bridge 4 are slaughtered. Now over to Szeth, wielding Nightblood, who screams at him to destroy evil. He tears through Amaram's troops in pursuit of the Fused carrying the gemstone, and as he fights, the Fused evade his strikes and steals the sword's sheath, leaving Szeth vulnerable and unable to stop Nightblood as black veins creep up his arm. Lift rushes to help, urging him to let go of Nightblood, but he can't. Lift places her hand against his head and tries healing him. She breathed life into him somehow, and the sword drank of it freely. Her eyes went wide as the black veins began to grow up her fingers and hands. Jasnah raises her shard blade to kill Renarin, who simply turns and looks at her and nods. Instead of striking, she embraces her cousin and vows to help him instead. Now this makes Renarin realize that his visions are not predestined. Renarin sees hope that other dark visions, including Dalinar's fall, can be prevented. As Dalinar is forced to relive the horrors of Rathalas, including Evi's screams, the Stormfather is banished, leaving him utterly alone. Odium pleads with Dalinar to give him his pain. Odium, believing Dalinar is now his, declares victory. He tells Turash that Dalinar will lead them. Amaram approaches with Nightblood's silvery sheath and receives Yelik Nar's smokestone from another Fused. Odium commands Amaram to swallow the smokestone to gain the power that he craves. Dalinar then refuses Odium's offer to take his pain. "You cannot have my pain, Dalinar. You cannot have my pain. Be sensible. I killed those children. No, I burned the people of Rathalas. I was there, influencing you. You cannot have my pain!" Dalinar feels the Stormfather's presence return and speaks the next oath. "I will take responsibility for what I have done. If I must fall, I will rise each time a better man. Dalinar hears a voice commanding him to unite them. Thousands of glory spren stream around him as he reaches into the cognitive realm with one hand and the spiritual realm with the other. His enemies recoil, except for Venli, who whispers, "What are you?" Dalinar hears Evie's gentle voice say, "I forgive you." And the weight of his guilt begins to lift. He turns to Venli and declares, "I am unity." He slammed both hands together and combined 3 realms into one. In Shadesmar, light erupts, driving the fused away. Honor's perpendicularity forms as a glowing pillar, its brilliance illuminating the battlefield. Syl identifies it as a manifestation of Honor's power. Meanwhile, the Herald Taln finally reacts to Ash. "Ash," he took her hand again. "What a wonderful thing." "Wonderful. We left you, Taln. What a gift you gave them. Time to recover. For once, between desolations, time to progress. They never had a chance before, but this time, yes, maybe they do." He feels hope for humanity's chances and instinctively knows that Dalinar is waiting for them. He then drags a reluctant Ash to go meet Dalinar. Renarin and Jasnah chase after the radiant light and glory spren pooling at the base of the city wall. Jasnah unleashes her soul casting and Shardblade to push back the possessed troops. Renarin is infused with stormlight and he sees the massive column of light stretching skyward. All while Teft, overcome by guilt but inspired by the surge of light, speaks the next oath of the Windrunners. His version is unique, swearing to protect those that he hates, even if the one he hates most is himself. Odium orders his forces to attack Dalinar. Amaram steps forward, but Dalinar tries to appeal to him, urging him to follow the path of redemption. But Amaram, consumed by guilt and unable to forgive himself, attacks with Oathbringer. Kaladin emerges from the glowing pillar, parrying with a shard spear, followed by Shallan and Adolin. Meanwhile, Lift still struggles against Nightblood's hunger, but when the scattered gemstones around them light up because of the energy of the perpendicularity, Szeth consumes the stormlight, satiating Nightblood. Lift chastises the sword for nearly consuming them, and a drowsy Nightblood admits that he was very hungry. She and Szeth then move towards the column of light. Now, Dalinar realizes that Elhokar has not emerged from the light, and he mourns his death. The glory spren disperse, and he suddenly feels drained. The Stormfather, astonished and uncertain of what has occurred, remarks on the unique connection they now share, one that didn't exist when Honor was alive. The Knights Radiant gather around Dalinar, and the Stormfather recognizes Taln and Ash as they arrive. Kaladin asks for orders, and despite being outnumbered by Amaram's thrill-driven forces, Dalinar quickly organizes his Radiants and sends them off on their own missions. He then steps forward to confront the Thrill, greeting it as an old friend. He relives past battles with every step as he plunges into the red mist. Dalinar grapples with the Thrill, embracing his past and rejecting its control. He thanks the Thrill for the strength it once gave him, but chooses to move forward without it. Amaram, now completely possessed by the unmade Yelek Nar, begins pulsing red and his shard plate leaks black smoke as he transforms. He wields both Oathbringer and Helleran's stolen shard blade, the same blade that took Tien away. Now Adolin, freshly healed by his brother, urges Shallan to be radiant and save the city. He summons his Shardblade and he thanks it and rushes to join the battle. Seeing some enemies be thrown, he peeks around a corner and sees Jasnah standing unscathed and surrounded by glowing geometric patterns of smoke that had been outlining her. Satisfied she doesn't need any assistance, he then moves to help some Thaylen soldiers fight a larger group of enemies, and eventually he saves the son of Queen Fen and rescues his mother and father trapped behind a wall. All while Shallan summons an army of illusions, pulling forth people from her sketches, including her family. But as the fight goes on and her illusions begin to falter, she feels Veil take her left hand and Radiant take her right, steadying her. Together, they command the army of illusions to charge. Now Yasna and Ivory discuss making use of the perpendicularity before it fades. With this immense reservoir of stormlight, she effortlessly soulcasts enemies into smoke, and then raises her hand to repair a breach in the wall. After, she soulcasts air into steps to reach the top of the wall to meet Navani and Queen Fen. She notices that Shallan is nearly out of stormlight. Then, nonchalantly, she defends the group from two fused, setting one on fire and tearing the other in half. Yasna commands them to hold the wall until Urathiru sends reinforcements. Meanwhile, Venli, just about to speak the first ideal, is grabbed by a fused looking for Tamber, who tells her she must choose who she serves. And she replies that she's chosen. And as the fused leaves, she realizes that Tamber is inside her gem heart, keeping her Voidspren captive. With no one watching, she then swears the first ideal. Szeth and Lift pursue the fused carrying the ruby through Shallan's illusions. Szeth clashes with the fused and he retrieves the gemstone, and Lift, having asked Shallan to cut a large rock and create an illusion of the ruby, manages to swap this fake ruby with the fused. She then takes the real one over to Dalinar in the red mist. As Amaram transforms further, his armor explodes, revealing a grotesque mix of carapace and flesh. Violet crystals begin jutting out of his skin, and he also seems to have access to the surge of cohesion, friction, and possibly many others. A fused joins the fight, and Kaladin allows the fused to impale him in the stomach, then lashes it up into the sky. Amaram gains the upper hand until Kaladin goads him to fight him in the sky, and here in his domain, he finds an opening and cracks the gemstone embedded in Amaram's chest, defeating the man who had lied to him, the man who had taken away Tien. However, there's no time to celebrate because 8 more fused show up to fight him. Over to Adolin. Despite not having his plate, he fights a Thunderclast. He speaks to his blade and he hears her voice in his mind say that her name is Mayalaran. He decides to call her Maya, and he manages to hack one of the feet free from the Thunderclast, and then he hurls his Maya blade to impale a fused and save a Thaylen Shardbearer. He ends up badly injured from the Thunderclast, but then Renarin intervenes. Renarin! He didn't have plate. How? The Thunderclast palm crashed down on Renarin, smashing him. Adolin screamed, but his brother's shard blade cut up through the palm, then separated the hand from the wrist. He seemed to heal more quickly than Kaladin or Shallan did, as if being crushed wasn't even a bother. After witnessing his little brother being awesome, he lends his blade to the Thaylen Shardbearer, Herdalm, who along with Renarin finish off the Thunderclast. Now, Shallan's illusions falter and fail as she runs out of stormlight, but before the fused overwhelm her, Yasna steps between and soulcasts the surface of stone into oil, then soulcasts a spark from air to create a barrier of flames. She reaches for Shallan, but instead Shallan puffs away into smoke, revealing that the real Shallan was in the form of Radiant. Shallan is then very impressed with how easily Yasna soulcast air into a prison of stone around the fused. Now Renarin, unfazed, confronts a dozen fused at the Oathgate. He sees a vision of Teft leading Bridge 4 into battle, and then smiling, he sees the Oathgate actually erupt with light as Teft arrives, wielding a silver shard spear and bringing troops with him. And just in time for Rock, glowing with stormlight, to save Kaladin's life by picking up Amaram's shard bow and shooting him with 2 massive arrows, killing Amaram and fully shattering the gemstone in his chest. Dalinar continues to grapple the Thrill when he feels Lift grab his hand and hand him the ruby. Holding the gemstone above his head, he embraces the Thrill one final time, sealing the unmade Nergal and marking the end of Odium's influence on the battlefield. The defenders cheer as the red mist dissipates and the fused retreat. Kaladin is healed by Lopen, and Dalinar, flanked by Lift, looks at Kaladin and simply says, "It's over." And then chapter 121 switches us to Moash, who's busy breaking up rubble in the Kholinar palace and is offered a task by the fused. They compliment his job on killing the king and ask if he would do the same to a god. They want him to kill Yezrien. Dalinar asks Navani to study the gemstone imprisoning Nergal, and also to teach him how to read. And Shallan is still struggling internally as Radiant and Veil vie for control. As Kaladin arrives, Veil briefly takes over, admiring him, but Shallan manages to suppress her alternate personalities. And later, Adolin, having noticed her feelings before, offers to step aside if she wishes to be with Kaladin. But she says she wants to be with him. She solidifies her commitment to Adolin, choosing him as her future husband and embracing her decision, while promising that neither Radiant nor Veil is going to disrupt her choice. Now, Lopen jokes around with Rua, and when asked how to become a Radiant, Lopen says it's easy: life before death, strength before weakness, journey before pancakes. He says that's the easy one, but the second ideal is hard. And then when he begins to say it, unexpectedly, this time, the words are accepted. Though he mocks the Stormfather for not acknowledging him earlier during the battle. He was saving this for a dramatic moment. Nael approaches Szeth, speaking of the Herald's torment on Braze, and he tells Szeth that he's not angered with him for choosing the other side, and admits that his own judgment is also flawed. Szeth swears the third ideal of the Skybreakers, swearing to follow the will of Dalinar Kholin, and this grants him access to the Surge of Division. He then chooses what his fourth ideal is going to be when he's ready, and he vows to cleanse the Shin of their false leaders so long as Dalinar agrees. Now, in the temple of Talena-Lat, Dalinar confronts Taravangian, who admits his plan to seize control of the Coalition had the Alethi forces fallen. He also informs Dalinar of Kharbranth's possession of Bata, the Herald, and her warning about the impending true desolation. And then we move back to Moash. In the presence of the Fused, he stabs a mad refugee in Kholinar using an unusual gold knife. The act marks the final death of Yezrien, the king of the Heralds and the greatest human to ever live. The gold knife trails dark smoke when he pulls it free, and the sapphire on the pommel begins to glow. And then switching to Ashe, who drags Taln through Thaylen City, intending to reach the Oathgate and escape to Azure. And as Moash kills Yezrien, Ashe feels something within her break. She collapses unconscious for the first time in millennia, and this draws Yasna's attention. Yasna recognizes Ashe and Taln for who they are because of the drawings that Hoid had given her. Kaladin, flying over the southern coast of Elithkar, finds his and Shallan's squires who escaped Kholinar. Scar and Drehi reveal they've saved several people, including young Gavinor, the heir to the Alethi throne. And they've also sworn the second ideal of the Windrunners. And then back in Urathiru, Taravangian spends his days struggling with puzzles, his limited intelligence evident. But then Odium enters the room, mocking the diagram while showcasing the eternity of his own plans. Now, part of the words of the diagram have faded from gold to black, a ripple in what Odium can see. And at its root, Taravangian sees the name Renarin Kholin. Somehow, Renarin has been messing up their plans, and he's blinded Odium. Taravangian tries to bargain for the safety of all humanity, but instead he secures protection for the people of Kharbranth and their spouses, pledging his service to Odium in return. Meanwhile, as the Coalition leaders debate upcoming strategy, Adolin refuses Dalinar's attempt to make him king of Elithkar, and he confesses that he killed Sadeas, violating the codes of war. And shortly thereafter, Pelona and Siberial reflect the general sense of worry about who's going to lead, when Yasna, wearing a crown, walks in as queen. Back in Kholinar, Moash is approached by 9 Fused who present him with Yezrien's honor blade. Leshwi warns him that if he takes the blade, he will die and Moash will be no more. Accepting the blade, they rename him Vyre, meaning he who quiets. Moash lashes himself to the sky, ascending with his new purpose. Meanwhile, Shallan, preparing for her wedding with Adolin, is surprised when her brothers, Balat, Wickham, and Jushu visit her in Urithiru, and Balat delivers a note from Meraze. The note informs her that her debt for breaking a soulcaster has been repaid due to her efforts with Re-Shephir, but she's now tasked with persuading Shah Anat to ally with the Ghostbloods. Now, the final chapter then ends with Dalinar, under Navani's guidance, handwriting the preface and the title page of his memoir, Oathbringer, the assassin in white sitting outside the room guarding the door as Dalinar's new bodyguard. And then that finally brings us to the epilogue. Now, Wit stands in a line, and he speaks philosophically about how all great art is divisive. He says art is about emotion, examination, and going places people have never gone before to discover and investigate new things. Which sounds kind of like what he's doing. He insults the man in front of him and cuts the line, only to be punched, losing a tooth. Apparently, this was his intention. He thanks the man and he walks into an alley, seeming to absorb the emotions of those struggling around him. Then reaching a courtyard near the palace, Wit approaches a woman named Kenny sitting beside an empty cradle. Continuing his musings on art, he asks how many people need to appreciate a work to make the hatred it inspires worthwhile. He then changes the subject and fashions a crude doll from rags and a cord that he carries, and oddly, he feels life in a building nearby. A little girl emerges, refusing to leave her mother, who's implied to be dead, and Wit speaks some words to the doll, and suddenly it animates, and he sends it walking down the street. And animating this seems to drain the brown color from his coat and leaves it gray. The curious girl follows, leaving the building, and Wit gently carries her to Kenny and her husband. He then tells the doll to forget what he told it before and instead instructs it to take care of the girl. And then answering his earlier question about art, he says it only takes one person. He urges them to take care of the child, explaining that he must leave the city. And then, still disguised as a beggar, Wit approaches the palace, passing a fused sentry named Vatwa, whom apparently he once danced with long ago. He notices the fused and singers looking for something in the rubble, and then Wit oddly begins speaking to the wall, and then feigning madness, he pretends to trip near a standing wall and addresses an unseen entity, coaxing it to reveal itself. A cryptic emerges, its shifting pattern slipping into his hand. Wit hides the spren in his rags as the guard throws him out of the gardens. Alone, he speaks gently with the frightened cryptic, saying, "Life before death, little one." And that ends the epilogue. Now, there is some COSMERE Easter eggs here in regards to Warbreaker. It's not anything too big, but it is very, very interesting. So I'm going to discuss that right now. Not only was Hoyd very clearly using Awakening on the doll to give it life, draining the color from his jacket, but he also used another Nalthian ability called Life Sense. And this is how he was able to sense the life of the little girl in the fallen building. Now, the book then ends with a Ketik written by Yasna Kholin on the occasion of Shallan Davar's wedding. And like each of the other books, this Ketik is made by combining the titles of all 5 parts of the book. And that ends Oathbringer, Book 3 in the Stormlight Archive. I'm gonna get working on a Rhythm of War summary very soon. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. This was a massive project. I put a lot of work into this. It's kind of a passion project at the same time, and I eventually, like I said, I eventually want to summarize all the books in the COSMERE. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Anyways, I'll see you guys soon.